firefighters and the police just to tell you the names of people they know who went in before them and they're not sure came out.
Thanks very much, Diane. So I must tell you, for the future, it's very hard to hear you down there because of the emergency equipment that's working in Midtown. I'm sure your engineers will tell you if we could move you just a little bit away from that, we'd like very much to hear clearly as we can, obviously, under the circumstances, what you were saying. Just thinking for a second there about the thousands of people who are outside the country, when you think that one airport in Eastern Canada had 27 aircraft and 5,000 people, and it's happening all the way across the continent, people stranded tonight, and one assumes, though the cell phone network in the United States, at least today, certainly in the Eastern United States, was jammed with people trying to make calls related to this incident, the press, government officials, emergency officials. One assumes, because we haven't got any phone numbers for you, I'm afraid, of people in other places tonight who are expected to be somewhere else, and they all appear, as far as we can tell by the reporting that we're getting from a variety of places, are okay. They're just spending a night in some place they did not intend to be. We've had a couple of chances today to talk to Jerry Hauer, who is the man who set up New York City's emergency headquarters on the west side of Manhattan, right down there by the trade towers, which is no longer usable today because it was, if not one of the first, one of the early victims of these two extraordinary collapses of the two trade tower buildings. But he's with us again tonight. Jerry, grateful that you came back. You just tell us what you know that's going on.
Well, there's a massive effort underway right now, Peter, to get medical resources into the city. As you heard earlier, Secretary Thompson has mobilized a number of Department of Health and Human Services, DMAT teams, DMORT teams, which are the mortuary teams. They are bringing in the Comfort, which is a naval ship that is a hospital ship that will help provide resources and much-needed beds. Joe Albaugh, the director of FEMA, is coordinating the federal government's effort to assist the city and Washington, D.C., and there will be numerous urban search and rescue teams coming into the city to aid with dogs, with search equipment, to aid New York City's firefighters, because clearly this is going to be a long-term operation. Our firefighters here in the city, our police and emergency medical services have been absolutely heroic today in their efforts. A number of them have become victims in the process today in trying to rescue people in these buildings, and the fatigue will set in, but they are the consummate professionals. They will do everything they can to continue to try and search for victims, but there will come a point very soon where once the fire is out, they will start to pick through the rubble.
Gary?
Yes.
Let me interrupt you and even be more specific, if I may. Mike Carter is the Vice President of the Firefighters Union, estimates that half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene at the trade tower may be dead. And here's what he says: we have entire companies that are just missing. We have lost chiefs. And Cardinal Edward Egan, the Roman Catholic cardinal in New York City, who administered the last rites to a dozen victims, said the firefighters and the police were dead in great numbers. Now, I don't mean to reach out for numbers except to quantify the scope of this disaster, much of which we can see on our face. But what can you add to those two comments?
Well, first of all, many of those people, the chiefs that I heard on the radio as I was listening to this evolve are very close personal friends. Many of the police officers, the emergency service unit, these are the people that were the first responders, the first two rescue units, the first two fire units, were all in the building either doing rescues or firefighting, and they transmitted a third alarm almost immediately, which is upwards of 150 to maybe 200 firefighters, and then they rapidly brought in more resources. They transmitted a fifth alarm and then an additional fifth alarm. So there were hundreds and hundreds of firefighters and police officers trying to save the people in those buildings. And to try and quantify it at this point, how many people?
No, I didn't mean to make you do that. I just want to know whether or not you you were aware of what the head of the Firefighters Union and Cardinal Egan have said in terms of the dimension of the disaster for the fire department.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. Pictures tell the story of the day we prayed would never come.
Up there, yeah, now remember, oh my God.
Hijacked airliners crash into the heart and soul and strength of America. The World Trade Center.
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
And the Pentagon. Terror in the skies. Panic on the ground. Casualties beyond counting.
They started jumping out of the window, like of the 96th floor. They just started, one at a time, from different parts of the building. I just started seeing people just drop and drop and drop.
Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. America under attack. Good evening. We are temporarily breaking into ABC News coverage to bring you some important local coverage. It is a day of unimaginable horror as America reels from the devastation.
President Bush is going to address the nation in about 30 minutes. Tonight, he promised the U.S. will, quote, hunt down those responsible for these cowardly actions. As you have no doubt heard by now, 2 hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York this morning. Another hijacked plane crashed into the Pentagon. A 4th crashed in Pennsylvania. It is likely thousands of Americans are dead. KOMO's Kevin Reese begins our coverage now with a look at the events as they unfolded. Kevin?
It was 8:45 Eastern Time this morning. That's when this all started. Terrorists hitting the heart of American wealth and military power. The World Trade Center towers are destroyed. They are gone. The Pentagon is heavily damaged. And thousands, as we've told you, are presumed dead, including the more than 250 on board the hijacked planes. These were the first pictures. All we knew was that a plane had crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center. It looked like a horrible, terrible, unthinkable accident. But then it happened again.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
My God.
That looks like a second plane.
It was another jetliner into the second tower. And another angle taken by a freelance photographer on the ground shows the frightening collision.
Completely in one side and out the other.
It just disappeared. It disappeared like a bad special effect. It disappeared right into the building. I've seen it 6, 7 times now. It's still incomprehensible.
It was unbelievable seeing this second jet come crashing into the second tower. What is going on?
KOMO radio reporter Tammy Michaels was asking the same frightening questions. In a hotel literally across the street, she watched as workers trying to escape the building and the fires jump to their deaths.
And people are actually falling from the World Trade Center. It's completely engulfed in flames. I'm directly across the street, the Millennium Hilton on the 35th floor. And right in front of me right now, I can see the entire building engulfed in flames. People are trapped on the upper floors and are dropping to their deaths right in front of me.
Oh, my God.
It is the most horrible thing I've ever seen.
And it would get even more horrible. As police and firefighters rushed in to help, the damaged trade towers began to fall. The first at 10 a.m., the second a half hour later.
Oh my God, there it goes!
There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
And in Washington, D.C., too, a third jetliner had slammed into the Pentagon, slicing completely through the building.
Streaking down and it hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
And then in Pennsylvania, the 4th plane, another Boeing jet, crashes near Pittsburgh. A passenger on board with a cell phone had said they had been hijacked. Officials believe this plane's target was Camp David. But the frightening images were still coming. From Ground Zero, this is where the World Trade Centers used to stand, with an unknown number of people, including office workers, firefighters, paramedics, and police, buried somewhere inside.
All that's standing are the Twin Towers right now in the background. That's all that's standing. That's it. That's all that's left.
And hours later, another building collapsed, Building 7 of the World Trade Center complex, as it is known. Again, thousands of people are presumed dead in these attacks, and to give you some idea of the scope of this tragedy, about 50,000 people work in each trade tower. Another 90,000 people visit the World Trade Center each and every day. But again, we don't know exactly how many people have been killed, but it could be days before we know just how many people we lost today. Gary, Kathy?
Thank you, Kevin. And if you are worried about friends or family members who may have been there, there is a number you can call for information. It's 1-800-331-0075. Again, 1-800-331-0075. If you have any information that could help, call the FBI hotline. That number, 1-866-483-5137, 866-483-5137. And we have put these telephone numbers and others on our webpage, KOMO-TV.com.
As soon as it became apparent that airliners were being used as weapons, all U.S. airports were shut down, including SeaTac Airport. Our live KOMO cam shows an eerie sight at the normally busy airport tonight. Nothing is moving. SeaTac is closed. The question is, for how long?
Well, the Federal Aviation Administration now says at least until tomorrow morning, but all of that could change. KOMO's Keith Eldridge has been at the airport since shortly after this tragedy. Keith, what are you hearing about when SeaTac might reopen?
Latest word from the FAA, Kathy, is that it will reopen at 9 a.m. That's 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. You may hear on the network coverage 12 noon, but that's East Coast time indeed. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. That's, as we look out on the tarmac here, is when these planes will start moving again, as far as we can tell at this time. Right now, everything is grounded. Nothing is moving. This morning, a lot of confusion, but no panic.
Terrible.
Travelers and ticket agents are trying to cope with the tragedy on the East Coast and its effect all across the nation, closing all airports.
It's incredibly shocking. So sad. It's just incredibly sad.
SeaTac was jammed with people now forced to make emergency plans, forced to find a place to stay, forced to find other ways of getting to their destinations, including a young couple trying to get to New York to be married Saturday.
I guess we're on our way home. I think we're going to drive. I mean, especially with something like this happening, I'm not too sure I want to fly anyways.
Planes that were in the air were turned around, and planes heading to SeaTac were allowed to land. Everyone else was immediately grounded, including planes that were ready to take off.
Actually, the passengers were very calm. There was no commotion on the plane. The flight crew was outstanding.
But then reality hit. Travelers saw the pictures from New York. They heard that passenger jetliners were the weapons. They realized their flights could have been targets.
It just hit me then. That it's really terrible. Tragic. It's a tragic thing. People get upset about security, and I think this is sort of a wake-up call. You know, we need to be stringent about our security.
Toward that end, Port Police closed the arrival and pickup ramps to the airport. Then, as it became clear no planes would be taking off until tomorrow at the earliest, the departure gates were closed, and security officers swept the area looking for bombs. Unfortunately, we can tell you no bombs were found, nothing untoward found out here at SeaTac Airport. We mentioned a number of flights were diverted to other airports. We understand that a number of buses are headed this way, 20 of them coming in from Vancouver, British Columbia, 3 coming in from Portland, and 1 from Spokane. Several hundred people heading this way right now. Their plans were all up in the air when they arrived here at SeaTac Airport. They hope to get on other flights tomorrow. Again, all flights starting around 9 o'clock in the morning. People are encouraged to be out here a bit earlier than that, but they're also encouraged to stay tuned to television, stay tuned to Channel 4, because that time could change at any moment. Reporting live at SeaTac, Keith Eldridge, KOMO 4 News.
Just a logistical nightmare. Keith, thanks very much for all the live updates throughout the day. SeaTac, as you know, isn't the only airport closed around here. The King County Airport, better known as Boeing Field, also shut down. Private planes as well as cargo planes for UPS, Airborne Express, all grounded. Airlift Northwest, which responds to accidents and emergency calls, also grounded. The Army is on standby to conduct rescues with their helicopters if necessary. And for most of the day, ferry traffic has been all but crippled by the attacks. The boats closed to all vehicles just after 9 this morning, and they just started carrying cars again about 3 in time for the evening commute. Coast Guard officials were worried about the possibility of car bombs.
Police shut down several local buildings as a security precaution, including Seattle's tallest building, the Bank of America Columbia Tower, and the Washington Mutual Tower. The Seattle Space Needle was also closed today. Employees and visitors alike were turned away after police cordoned off the area. Also closed today, many local malls, including Everett, Bellevue, and Northgate malls, and all Nordstrom stores. The Mariners and Rainiers games have been canceled, along with every Major League Baseball game. The Seattle Art Museum is closed. The Seattle Symphony has postponed tonight's event until tomorrow, and all events at the Seattle Center have been canceled. The Puyallup Fair is open, but tonight's Maya concert has been canceled. Boeing plants and the Hanford Nuclear Reservation are open, but operating with increased security. The state capitol has reopened, and Amtrak service has returned to normal. Well, security is also beefed up at military bases across our state.
A 25-mile no-fly zone was imposed around Bangor, which is home to one of the nation's largest nuclear weapons arsenals. Identification checks at Fort Lewis jammed up traffic on I-5 for a while today. There are increased measures also at the Navy base at Everett and Whidbey Island. And KC-135 refueling tankers from Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane have also been called on to assist other military aircraft. The scene no different at McCord Air Force Base.
Earlier this afternoon, the base was locked down because of a bomb scare. KOMO's Tracy Vetter joins us live from McCord this evening with more. Tracy?
Well, as you mentioned, all military bases in this area are at their highest level of security. Only people with military ID are being allowed in. Here at McCord, we are waiting for planes to take off carrying much-needed supplies, medical supplies, blood supplies, as well as search and rescue personnel on their way to help with the devastation on the East Coast.
Our 6-hour window is slowly leaving here.
By late this evening, 62 members of Puget Sound's urban search and rescue team will be in New York City. Their task, to search through the rubble of the World Trade Center towers looking for victims.
We're used to going in when everyone else is going out. So in that respect, they have an idea what they're going into. The problem here is the magnitude of this.
The crew members are police officers, firefighters, dogs specially trained to find people in tons of debris, and 2 doctors. All of the crew members have dealt with tragedy before. They all know they have never seen anything like where they're headed now.
There's a lot of apprehension. I guarantee you there's some fear involved, and a lot of concern for what we're walking into.
At McCord, concrete jersey barriers, specially trained military dogs, and extra manpower add an additional level of security. But a bomb scare late this afternoon stops all traffic completely until a bomb-sniffing dog can confirm the unclaimed bag is not a threat.
I live and die by supporting American standards, and I'm a patriot. And when situations like this occur, we have to take precautionary measures. There's no doubt in my mind.
Those precautions are mirrored at Fort Lewis, where the Army is also temporarily halting all artillery, mortar, and demolition training, so no one is unduly alarmed by loud explosions. And their thoughts are with their brothers and sisters in arms at the Pentagon.
As you might expect, of course, we're all concerned with what we witnessed today.
Now, the plan here today was to get this search and rescue crew out of here by 5 o'clock, wheels up tonight on its way to New York. That has not happened. McCord is still waiting for its orders. So the hope is that this crew can be out of here and in New York still by later tonight to try and get help there as soon as possible. Reporting live from McCord Air Force Base, Tracy Vetter, KOMO-4 News.
Tracy, thank you for the update.
As you know, there have been new developments really pouring in all day long, and sometimes it's been difficult to figure out what's related to today's events and what is not.
Among the newest developments, a missile attack in Kabul, Afghanistan. At first, there was speculation that this was a possible retaliatory strike by the United States or some of our allies. ABC News, however, has learned that, and Pentagon officials have confirmed that the attack is unrelated and is a matter of internal violence in Afghanistan with no U.S. involvement.
11 hours after the terrorist attack, America's financial center and its military nerve center, the death toll remains unknown.
The shockwave rippled through Seattle, where thousands of workers were ordered to evacuate. KOMO's Michelle Esteban reports.
The management came around and said, everybody goes away.
What happened to David Oak happened to thousands of Seattle employees.
I just come into work and the doors were all locked.
Everybody's in shock.
Shocked that terrorism's reach has stretched clear across the country.
I had heard the initial reports of the 2 planes crashing into the World Trade Center, but It wasn't until we got into the building and we actually started watching television reports where both the towers had collapsed. That's when it was, you know, kind of hit home.
I don't feel very comfortable right here at all, so I'm glad we're going home.
At the corner of Fifth Avenue and Columbia Street, in 2 buildings, 7,000 workers were told to go home.
All these different people standing around, they're lost too. You know, so it's not that everybody's standing out here because they're calm. Everybody's standing out here because what choice do you have?
Suddenly, Seattle's symbols like the Bank of America Tower, the Space Needle, became symbols of how vulnerable we are.
The tallest building in Seattle, I'm not sure I really want to be here. And then the first thing I heard was that the building was evacuated.
Every major coffee shop in downtown Seattle was closed with a similar note to customers because of the New York attack, due to current events in the U.S. and for the sake of safety. There was no coffee today, just disbelief.
I can't believe it happened. It's like a movie, like it's not even real, like it's not true. It hasn't even like hit me that it's really happened.
Now, I met a lot of people today who were in a state of shock, as I mentioned in the report, but as the day moved on, the attitude changed. It went from shock to anger, and I started hearing a lot of words about intense retaliation. As you noticed, there were a number of buildings that had posted signs saying they were closed today. Those signs also said, watch the news. That's how you'll find out if our building will be open tomorrow. So when we know, we'll let you know. It's the very latest. Reporting live from downtown, I'm Michelle Esteban. Back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. In an unprecedented move, the U.S. Navy positioned 3 ships in Puget Sound, 2 frigates and a destroyer.
One of those ships is actually operating in Elliott Bay, just off downtown Seattle right now. KOMO's Joe Furia joins us live from the waterfront with more. Joe?
All 3 of the ships are out of the Everett home port. Now take a look behind me right now into Elliott Bay. And Kathy, as you said, an unprecedented sight. The USS Rodney M. Davis is patrolling the waters just off downtown Seattle. This ship was built to provide defense against air, surface, and submarine threats. It has guns, guided missiles, torpedoes, and helicopters on board, along with about 200 sailors. The other 2 ships, the frigate USS Ford and destroyer USS Fife, are also out in the Sound, though we can't see them from here. We have gotten reports from Bremerton that one of them may be supporting the naval shipyard. All this, we are told, is precautionary. The same thing the city's been telling us about their emergency responses to potential terrorist threats throughout the day.
There are still no direct threats to our city.
Seattle Mayor Paul Schell tries to instill a sense of calm into a day filled with chaos. After the initial terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, Seattle went on high alert. SWAT teams were deployed, rescue units strategically placed. The mayor, police chief, and fire chief all gathered at the city's emergency operations center to make plans and protect people against what was until this morning the unthinkable.
Our specialized units such as our SWAT team, our harbor patrol, our bomb unit, and our intelligence units have all been pre-positioned and all been assigned to some very specific duties.
We continue to monitor the situation closely. I intend to be here. We intend to keep the Emergency Operations Center up as long as it takes until everybody's comfortable that there's no need for this.
The city remains under heightened security, as does the rest of our state, and for the first time since the days of World War II, Navy ships, like the Rodney M. Davis behind me, patrol the waters of Puget Sound. Reporting live in Seattle, Joe Furia, KOMO 4 News.
Thanks very much, Joe.
As you watch coverage of today's horrific events, you may feel frightened, angry, and helpless.
But there are some things that many of us can do to help, and many are doing. KOMO's Emily Langley is at the blood bank on Seattle's First Hill right now, where it's been a very busy place. Emily?
Very busy place. The line waiting to give blood stretches down this hallway, down and out the door here into the street. They are telling me this will be the biggest single day of blood donations in the history of the Puget Sound Blood Bank. Here on First Hill, already more than 129 people have given blood. At the 9 centers total, it will be 2,000 blood donors today.
We can't have it on the sidewalk.
The blood center brought out chairs for the 3 to 4 hour wait. Businesses donated food. For some, the haunting TV images made them come.
We saw a man fall out a window on TV. The whole thing is just really insane.
There's no feeling right now. It's horrible. It's horrible.
feel like they're helping in some way, and small way, but hopefully this will help.
Some came after their offices in downtown skyscrapers were evacuated for the day.
When news of the event started to filter through.
News reports played for those inside at the clinic. Megan Johnson made an appointment as soon as she heard she has family in New York and Washington, D.C.
And it took us about 2 hours to find out that they were fine and they weren't in the area. So it was good news.
Everyone wanted to contribute somehow.
I'm downtown every day, and I'm generally up in a big building, and I can't imagine, you know, the horror that many of those people felt. But I do know that we need to participate.
It's the best thing we could do at this point, I think. Because I think there was a national shortage, as there was already, and then we have these catastrophes hitting. So, waiting in line a few hours, that's fine. That's easy to do.
And the need will last for weeks.
It's not a one-day crisis, unfortunately, for the needs of the victims' needs.
And so they're encouraging people to give blood over the next few days. In fact, the blood center will open tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. It closes tonight at 8, and at this point, they have people waiting in line that'll take them all the way up until that time. They do want people to make an appointment to come in and give blood, and you can call their 1-800 number there on your screen, 1-800-398-7888. Also, you can get an appointment online. If you go to KOMO-TV.com, you can find how to go online to the Puget Sound Blood Center. Reporting live on First Hill, Emily Langley, KOMO 4 News.
Emily, in the midst of all the horror, it's gratifying to hear about that response. Thank you.
In addition to giving blood, you can also help by donating to the Red Cross. They have launched a massive effort in both New York and Washington, D.C., providing food, shelter, and relief for victims of these attacks and people who have been forced to evacuate. To find out how to make a direct donation, call 1-800-HELP-NOW. That's 1-800-435-7669.
And we are organizing a help effort as well. You can send donation to KOMO's People Helper Disaster Relief. The address is Post Office Box 19087, Seattle, Washington, the zip code 98109. Or you can call 206-441-HELP. All of the money you send will be forwarded to the Red Cross and earmarked for New York and Washington, D.C. disaster relief.
And we've just learned that Washington Mutual Bank is giving $250,000 to the Red Cross for disaster relief. So already local businesses are responding in a big way.
When the attacks happened, security was increased everywhere, including at the U.S.-Canadian border.
And KOMO's April Zepeda joins us live tonight from the border checkpoint at Blaine with new details from there. April?
Well, after about a 20-minute closing this morning, the border is open again, but there are delays, and there are certainly some people that are being turned away because security here is at an all-time high. Both the U.S. and Canadian flags are flying at half staff as traffic is funneled into just 2 lanes entering both countries. Now, rather than spot checks, all cars coming into the U.S. are going through careful inspection. U.S. Customs agents are turning back all non-U.S. residents, telling them only those on official business are allowed into Washington state. Now, the truck crossing is under particular scrutiny. Agents are going through everything, whether it's a commercial semi or just vacationers on a Winnebago. But everyone we talk to is understanding of the delays.
Well, there are things that need to be done, and I don't mind waiting. It's not a problem.
Well, my concerns go out to the people that lost loved ones in the crash. And I've got people in New York, too, so.
Now, shops at the border do remain closed, many of them posted with signs that say shut down due to a national emergency. The U.S. Border Patrol Office is also closed to the public in a lockdown mode. Now, agents are asking everybody, if you do not have to cross the border, please don't, because if you do come up here, you risk delays up to an hour-and-a-half wait or even being turned away. At the U.S.-Canadian border, April Zepeda, KOMO 4 News.
All right, thanks for that update, April.
Local crisis lines are ringing off the hook tonight as people try to deal with the stress and the feelings of vulnerability created by the attacks. The King County Crisis Line is fully staffed and managers have added extra capacity. That number is 206-461-3222.
And a lot of people have been gathering all over our region today at local churches and synagogues to pray for the victims.
KOMO's Ken Schramm joins us from St. James Cathedral in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, where a special service is underway. Ken?
You're a single bagpiper with his tribute in the background, that bagpiper with his tribute to the people killed and injured today. People have been seeking solace here at St. James Cathedral throughout the day. At noon, and a mass estimated at about 1,700 people crowded into the church. There were nurses in hospital scrubs. There were people in business suits and delivery uniforms. Mothers came with their babies. The service that's starting here soon, I think, is going to be much the same, although with fewer people. As one woman said, they're here because they feel a need to perhaps touch upon something greater than themselves in the wake of today's incomprehensible events. I listened earlier as a young man asked a woman near him if she was Catholic, and when she told him yes, he said he was Baptist, and asked if it would still be okay for him to light a candle. And then I watched as each of them lit one. Throughout the day here, a single bell has tolled at the top of each hour at St. James, echoing off the buildings in the area. It seemed to be emanating from everywhere. Inside the cathedral now, there are people who are praying for strangers, praying for a nation, praying for themselves. And at 7:30, there will be an interfaith service also conducted here. Christians, Jews, Muslims, all seeking a place to be together, I think in the hope that it will bring them all closer. Back to you.
Sound of that bagpipe, Ken, very sobering. Thank you for the report.
In addition to churches and the blood bank, a lot of people have been showing their support in many other ways. In West Seattle, a lot of people left flowers at the small Statue of Liberty, which sits on Alki Beach. Someone has also draped the statue with the American flag. Notes taped to the statue express sympathy for all of the victims of today's attacks and say the American spirit will not be broken by cowards. And at the Seattle Center there, we showed you the flag is at half-staff in honor of those who lost their lives today and who have been victims of this. The flags at every building in towns and surely many homes are also at half-staff. And of course, as we've told you, as you know, the attack has paralyzed travel around the nation and the world. So what should you do if you have plans to fly in the next few days or you have a loved one who's stuck somewhere? Well, we spoke with travel expert Steve Danishek about that. He says if the attack has made you too nervous to fly, airlines will give you a refund, or if you want to reschedule, you can do that without a penalty. If you have to fly, he says get to the airport 2.5 hours before your flight.
Until the systems get working, there are going to be delays, and I think it's paramount that they get there as early as possible.
So if you have plans to travel during the next few days, Danishek says be sure to call your carriers for the latest flight information first. When there is a catastrophe involving commercial airliners, we turn to aviation expert John Nance for information and guidance. KOMO's Theron Zahn spoke with him just a short while ago.
It imploded. God in heaven, it imploded.
Aviation expert John Nance had seen airplanes do everything until he saw this.
The pilots who were in charge of those various flights must have been either killed or completely removed from the cockpit.
Nance spent all day explaining to Peter Jennings and America what may have happened in the cockpits of the doomed plane when the hijackers took control.
None of us, or out of 29,000 professional airline pilots, are going to go crash an airplane into a building or into the Pentagon. That's just not going to happen. So, I mean, you know, the attitude of all of us would be go ahead and shoot.
Nance believes the terrorists have been trained to fly the 4 Boeing jets to their deadly targets.
They had their own pilots. This is the most highly coordinated attack on any country, really, in a terrorist way. And
the hijackers on one flight did not complete their mission, crashing about 20 miles from Camp David.
So one of the questions is here, were they shot down? Was this airplane shot down? Certainly that order would probably have to have come from the White House or have to come from the president.
And trying to comprehend the destruction that came from the sky today, Nance quoted another president, Roosevelt.
Said, this is a day which will live in infamy. Well, this is another one.
Theron Zahn, KOMO 4 News.
Nance says Boeing 757s and 767s may have been chosen for the terrorist attack because a pilot trained on one would also be able to fly the other. In all, 266 people were on board the planes that crashed.
An Army Reserve sergeant from Bellingham was in the Pentagon at the time of the attack. We spoke with Jerry Warren by phone this afternoon. He was taking a computer class in the lower level of the Pentagon just left of the site of the attack. He was on the computer reading about the World Trade Center attacks when he heard and felt 3 thunderous booms.
When you start smelling the dust from collapsing concrete, you know it's getting serious, because there's walls in that place that are 4 feet thick. I mean, it's a huge structured building, and you start smelling it, you know you're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Just a day earlier, Warren says he was working in the area that was attacked. It terrifies him, he says, to think of the people lost. He says he's on active duty and will be in Washington, D.C. until further notice.
We, of course, will continue to follow the latest developments in these attacks on America today. We hope you'll stay with us on the air and online at KOMO-TV.com.
As we mentioned earlier, President Bush is scheduled to address the nation in just a moment or two. We will be back with another local update at 6:30 or before then if there are breaking developments. Right now, we return you to ABC News.
From the Cold War days, put into a bunker or down the rabbit hole, as it was described to us. ABC's Ann Compton was with him all day and talked all day about the struggle between the security and the political apparatus, whether the president could get back to Washington. Well, the president is back in Washington now, and there has been no time in his presidency, and there may never be a time like this again, when it has been so important what he says to the country, because I think we all know at moments like this, the country looks to the President of the United States for understanding, for knitting the country together, and some presidents do it brilliantly, and some do not. Here is Mr. Bush. Okay, this was well, the President isn't sitting there trying to think about what to say, I can assure you. The President is sitting there because someone on network television has sat him down and said, we'll cue you in 30 seconds, Mr. Bush. And so, as awkward as it looks to him, this is what we've expected him to do. And now here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
The President of the United States, when he is in many respects needed most. And we've been joined by George Stephanopoulos, who's been downtown all day and who very quickly picked up, George, that the President may have given us a hint in his first couple of lines there to the magnitude of this.
He said thousands of lives that were suddenly ended. The first number we've had all day by an official verifying the magnitude of the casualties. Thousands of lives suddenly ended. He also did a lot of other things in this very short speech, Peter. He gave voice to the anger that many Americans are feeling. He talked about the quiet, unyielding anger of America, and then was very pointed in giving reassurance. The military is prepared. The emergency teams are on their way. Government will be back to business tomorrow. Our economy will be back to business tomorrow. And then finally, Peter, what I found most interesting in the section about where he talked about retaliation, he said America would make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them, which is a message to any state which may be supporting these terrorists who are behind this act.
Well, which creates a huge dilemma for the United States of America, because if it is discovered, as we've taught several times throughout the day, that a state, and I've forgotten who it was, a former director of the CIA perhaps earlier today, who said he couldn't believe that a state would actually support Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, who said directly he couldn't believe that a state would actively support an act such as this, though it may have over periods of time, as Iran and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan have all been suspected to do, give collateral or indirect support down through the years.
The word that the President used was so expansive, Peter. It wasn't just supported or funded. It was any who harbored them, who may have given them sanctuary at any time. That is a very open-ended commitment.
And then I thought, by the way, also, if I may add, that this President particularly, who feels so strongly about his Christianity, felt it a good time to say, to quote those lines from Psalm 23, even though I walk, or yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, because God is with me. And that will just sit so appropriately, I believe, in the minds and the sentiments of many Americans tonight. And we've felt throughout the day, we heard scattered reports of people going to churches and saying a prayer for those people who may or may not be lost, and for the families of those people around the country. Because don't forget, relatives in these locations have relatives all over the country. This is a total engagement with the nation. And I think you pretty much covered it all, except for one thing, George. The President talked also about the sense of safety and security of young people in America, particularly who were threatened today. And we heard that from people around the country today, people who simply could not believe, as it was the case at Oklahoma City, that this was happening in the United States. It's always something that happened somewhere else.
Or in the movies. And this is far worse than any plot that anyone could have ever devise. And I think I was downtown, as you mentioned today, Peter, so it was more surreal there, almost because people were so determined to get back to the normal life, even as all of downtown was being closed off. So I was a little bit cut off from what was happening around the country, but you did feel it down there.
But I think this is very characteristic of New York, and probably would have been characteristic of any other major community in the country, any other community as well. Terry Moran, who covers Mr. Bush for us today, but ironically wasn't with him today as he went on this education trip, not on normal. I think you are now, Terry, back at your regular location on the north lawn of the White House. Does that mean the White House has loosened up just a little bit?
Well, it has, Peter. The White House has leapt to life after several hours of the White House compound itself and the blocks around it in Washington essentially being deserted, a ghost town really coming in here. It is now a beehive of activity with government officials, cabinet secretaries. The president, of course, has returned. The First Lady has returned, and they are now working well into the night on this crisis. The president that you saw in these remarks, we are told, is the man who absorbed this tragedy today. He was described as steely throughout the day, as someone who did not react with great emotion or anger, who was able to see the pictures that America saw while he was in the air in Air Force One and reacted very seriously, very soberly, pretty much as we saw him tonight.
Now, you say that the White House is up and running again, full in action, though the White House is clearly never completely out of action, no matter where it is. But what do you actually mean by that? What are they doing?
Well, what we are seeing right now is the president and his top advisors huddled in the Oval Office and in the study off the Oval Office. We saw cabinet secretaries and FEMA Director Joe Albaugh were here earlier, and Joe Albaugh is still here. He is briefing the president on the emergency response teams that he's sent out. The president is receiving information from his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. You just see a great deal of activity. And you're right, this was not a completely deserted White House. Vice President Cheney was here, as was Dr. Rice, through the day. And in fact, we are told that the president, while he was in the air, had an open line of communication to the vice president throughout the day.
And Terry, you know as well as I do that much of the country had this feeling of helplessness today. As the president said, our sense of safety and security as a national entity were attacked today. They must have been just as frustrated because they didn't really know any more in the White House than we did on the outside.
They did not, and the president's response and the Secret Service's response to the events as they developed was determined by misinformation sometime. At one point, there was a report of a car bomb going off at the State Department. At another point, there was a report that this plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was on its way towards Camp David, and those things helped determine the Secret Service's decision to keep the president out of Washington, to put in place this plan to take him to Air Force bases which are predetermined and keep him away from harm.
So the staff works on at the White House to get some sense of what is it. Thanks, Terry. I'll come back to you in just a minute. And we've been joined in Washington by Leon Panetta, a former White House chief of staff for Bill Clinton, now out of government, back for the most part in California, if I remember correctly, Mr. Panetta.
That's correct.
So what's the White House chief of staff do at a moment like this? Where do you reach? What buttons do you try to push? Who do you try to connect with? Are you in some respects at the mercy of the military and intelligence establishment at the moment?
Well, you should not be. What you should do is try to organize the White House team so that the main focus is in the White House. You have your security people, your military people, your defense people. You have your national security advisor, your State Department people. I think it's better to run this kind of crisis directly from the White House so the president is in charge of not only what happened, but what to do.
Take us back to Oklahoma City and to the attack on the barracks residence at Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia. What am I, 96, 97? I apologize, I've forgotten.
I believe you're not 96.
Were you just immensely frustrated that you just didn't know anything?
Well, Oklahoma City, the first time we heard of Oklahoma City, it was on television. And we were sitting near the Oval Office watching television reports of what had happened. And it was only after it was first reported on television that we began to get some telephonic communication about what had taken place. But you feel rather helpless because you know a tragedy has taken place, but you don't know all of the facts and why it happened. And you know, Oklahoma is a good example of not jumping to conclusions, because in Oklahoma City, we had all kinds of thoughts that this was a Middle East terrorist effort in Oklahoma, and it turned out not to be. So I hope this country has the patience to carefully investigate, determine who really did this, and then respond.
To be open about it, we've said this several times today and reminded people in Oklahoma City that our tendency towards prejudice emerged pretty quickly and was proved to be wrong. As you have tried, I assume, to talk to people around the world today, have you picked up anything which contributes to the understanding of this?
Not really. I mean, you have obviously your suspicions about who's involved, but we are a country that believes first and foremost in justice. That's what distinguishes us from the people who carried out these acts. So I hope we take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who did it, and then take appropriate action. That's what a great democracy does.
But there is, Mr. Panetta, tremendous pressure on the president to strike back at somebody. We've struck back at Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan, didn't get him, spent a fortune, and didn't accomplish very much. Is the pressure on the president huge to do something in order to satisfy the anger and the frustration of the American people?
The pressure is incredible, Peter. It's coming from politicians on Capitol Hill. It's coming from constituents. It's coming from, I'm sure, many in the public who want to strike back in some way. The president is a leader of this country. He's got to take the time to make sure we do what's right. And what's right in this instance is to take the time to fully investigate this matter, determine who are the culprits, and then take appropriate action. That's been the course of action that the United States has taken in the past, and it's the course of action we've got to take now.
Thanks very much, Leon Panetta, for joining us, reminding us that the president's resolve will be tested, but also so will be his patience. We talked a lot about the attack on Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1990s when American military personnel posted in Saudi Arabia were the victims of a terrorist attack. And the retired General Wayne Downing is with us in the Washington Bureau. He was the senior military officer assigned to write the report on the Al-Khobar towers. And General Downing, you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, you are. There's one note in the note that was handed to me a while ago about you. You were responsible for making recommendations about making U.S. citizens safe from worldwide terrorist attacks. What were your recommendations, and is there anything that happened today which suggested your recommendations were not followed?
No, I think in this particular case, Khobar Towers was a surprise. It should not have been, because we had a bombing over there in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995. And Khobar, after that bombing, was assessed to be the #1 target in the Middle East. And in the subsequent bombing in June, we found ourselves surprised, a lack of situational awareness. I don't think that's the case today. I think people in our Congress, people in the executive branch, certainly the National Commission on Terrorism that I served on last year, it was a congressionally appointed commission, pointed out that we had a serious problem with the possibility of an attack by weapons of mass destruction. And if we saw anything today, we saw an attack with weapons of mass destruction.
General Downing, I've asked this question several times today. Perhaps you wouldn't mind answering it as well. There is a sense that the intelligence community or the counter-terrorist organizations in the country were consumed with the fear or the awareness of a chemical or biological weapons attack on the United States, and this kind of conventional attack got less than full appreciation, the potential of it. Is that a fair observation?
I don't think that's fair. I think certainly we have been concerned about chemical and biological, but I think that experts in this business have always felt that our greatest threat came from a kinetic energy weapon or an event like this, a suicide, if not aircraft, certainly a suicide bomber, suicide truck.
And do you agree with others today, particularly in the intelligence community, both in it currently and even some members of Congress who said the failure here is the United States' emphasis on human intelligence around the world, that one of the mistakes the United States made was to downgrade the degree of human intelligence that people thought was necessary?
Well, this is complicated.
We will return to network coverage momentarily, but as promised, we want to keep you up to date with new developments happening in Western Washington.
There's not supposed to be any activity in the airspace over Seattle or anywhere else in the state of Washington, the country for that matter, but there has apparently been some activity in the airspace above Seattle. KOMO's Margot Myers joins us with an eyewitness account of what did you see, Margot?
Well, Gary and Kathy, we were out on our back deck here, and my husband spotted a Navy jet. There was a small Cessna plane heading north over Shilshole, up north up Puget Sound, when a Navy jet came and basically chased it out of the airspace. The plane did make like a diversionary move, like it was moving out of the way of the jet, and the jet did make 2 passes by. Actually, I called the station to find out more about what you were hearing, because we have heard some jet planes flying overhead, and I know the airspace is closed, but we did see one Navy jet that looked like it was chasing a small, single-engine plane out of the airspace over Shilshole.
And then there was nothing after that. Did the jet seem to go, or the airplane seem to go on its way?
We can hear it circling. It sounds like it's circling back around, heading back towards Elliott Bay, but right now it's out of sight and we can't see anything. But it did make 2 passes overhead and came overhead pretty quickly, and then we can hear it still in the air, but can't see it any longer.
All right, Margot, thanks for the tip. We, of course, will be checking with the FAA to see if they have an identification on that aircraft and why it would be up, knowing that the airspace is closed and has been since this disaster early this morning. As you know, SeaTac shut down, and also Navy vessels, 3 of them now in Puget Sound in strategic locations of Bremerton, Elliott Bay, also, I assume, keeping a very close eye on any air activity.
And as you are probably aware by now, all U.S. airports are closed, have been since this morning, the first time in history that has happened. Obviously, by virtue of Margot's account, they are taking very seriously these no-fly zones. We will keep you posted. We'll return you now to network coverage. We'll be back with local developments as they happen. We'll be here for sure at 6:30 with an update on today's events locally.
Some more fairly late news from John Miller. John?
Since the rescue workers are now first starting to work that scene, they're starting to have some very interesting results. 2 Port Authority police officers, the Port Authority being the entity that runs the World Trade Center, have been found trapped in the rubble. There is a team of police officers trying to dig them out. They're apparently alive. A strange case, a 911 operator in Pennsylvania says she's received a call from people trapped in the rubble 40 feet from the Vista Hotel or the Millennium Hotel. They say they're near a fountain.
On the west side of Manhattan?
Yes,
right.
In the World Trade Center complex, and they're calling out from where they're trapped beneath the rubble to a 911, perhaps on a Pennsylvania cell phone, but it went to an operator in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of triangulate where they are to get to them. So things are picking up there. They've also brought in dogs from all the counties around the city to aid in helping to sniff victims out.
Exactly as we've said before today, exactly they do in the case of an earthquake. People are now underground, and dogs are just the best thing you have in trying to locate them.
Yet, as we've learned so often in modern times, in recent times, in Columbine, the role of the cell phone in modern disaster is incredible. From the people who called out from the airplane, something we really didn't expect, an odd development, to people perhaps calling out from the rubble, if that's a legitimate call to the Pennsylvania operator.
Great. John Miller will come back to you. Now to try to examine the building, ABC's Robert Krulwich has put together a piece on the structural engineering of the World Trade Centers, perhaps better able help us to understand that when these 2 aircraft hit these 2 towers today, exactly what was going on. Robert?
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength, and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Well, that report, as we look at New York City at night, which has a still quality about it tonight, the city of light at night, as so many American cities are, but there's a still, almost calm look of it from the sky. It's anything but that on the ground. But this is the second time from Robert Krulwich and also from some architect engineers we talked to a little earlier that say it was the heat which caused the building to collapse, because that the steel at the top of the building would maybe have only been able to sustain an hour and a half of intense fire, and then the steel begins, as Robert points out, so clearly collapse upon itself all the way down to the bottom. I think we have with us on the phone or in person from Seattle, John Magnuson, who is an engineer. John, are you there? John Magnuson, who is with the company that actually built the World Trade Center towers. John, have you heard our two layman explanations tonight of what it was we think collapsed the building, and do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I need to say one thing. At the time of the design of the World Trade Center, that was in the mid-1960s, and I was in 6th grade. So to kind of put in perspective how much time has passed since this design was actually completed. But the description of the fact that steel, when it gets up to 1,500, 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, that it loses its strength is accurate. The buildings actually survived the impact of both the planes, and it was really the fire that finally created the disaster.
And the upper floor fell on the next floor down, which fell on the next floor, and the sheer accumulation of weight just forced the whole building to collapse on itself.
Right there, from the videotape, and I can only go from what I've seen on television, but the videotape showed that several of the upper floors fell onto the next lower floor that was still intact. And once that happens, there's going to be an instant overload situation, and then it will fail. And then that will drop down to the next floor into another instant overload situation. And so the floors just progressively collapse down all the way to the bottom.
I appreciate very much the fact that you were very young in the mid-1960s when the trade towers were built. Though I have heard it said earlier today that they in fact, were stronger, more sensible structures than many of the more daring-shaped buildings that are being built in parts of the world today.
Right. The term that structural engineers use is redundancy. And the World Trade Center towers really set a new standard in redundancy. And that's why those airplanes were able to crash into the towers without causing the structural failure. The buildings were still standing. And then the problem was the fire and the jet fuel. And in normal buildings, all the steel is protected with fireproofing, and there's sprinkler systems, but they're not designed to protect against a jet fuel fire inside of a building.
Can you be a little more precise what you mean by redundancy?
Redundancy is that if you have a structural element that is damaged and is no longer able to carry the load, that load is able to be passed on to other elements or other columns or other beams within the building. And the columns on the World Trade Center, they were spaced at 39 inches on center, all the way across each face.
What does that mean, 39 inches at center?
Every 3 feet, 3 inches, there was a column that supported the building. So they were very closely spaced together. Many buildings, the columns are 10 or 15 feet apart or more. And so having these very close spaced columns on the outside created a lot of redundancy. That's why there was able to be a hole in the side. If you go back and look at the tapes, there was a tremendous hole in the side of the building, and it didn't collapse until the fire brought it down.
And trade tower number 7, which was the last to go, which was the building.
We want to interrupt ABC coverage for an update. Just minutes ago, we told you about reports of an F-14 in the skies above Seattle, possibly chasing a small aircraft.
And I just got off the telephone with the FAA and want to reassure you that the aircraft in the skies above Seattle are law enforcement airplanes and military airplanes. There are no general aviation or commercial aircraft in the skies over Seattle right now. There have been a few lifeguard flights, as they're called, flights transporting people to the hospital who may have been hurt or injured, but the aircraft that we've seen flying around Seattle are law enforcement accompanied by military airplanes, so nothing to worry about over Seattle. Again, no general aviation airplanes or commercial jets up there right now, so no need to worry about that.
Bottom line is all aircraft that you may have heard above you have been identified, and there is nothing to be afraid of. We'll return now to ABC network coverage. We'll see you at 6:30.
Said he would not be surprised if somewhere in the world there was a structural engineer who was part of this operation. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense. I sure would hope not. Every structural engineer is dedicated to preserving public safety, and just the thought that someone would take that training and use it for evil purposes just really disgusts me.
Is there anything I've missed, John? No? Okay. I'm very grateful for the time. What's it like up there in Seattle tonight? People feeling exactly the same thing people here in New York City are feeling?
Yes, and there was certainly a lot of apprehension during the day. Many of the buildings were evacuated just as precautionary measures. But there's this same empty feeling in your stomach about the whole thing, and just watching. People, of course, were glued to the coverage on the television set.
Well, thank you for being so articulate about it and helping us understand, at least thank you very much, from the slightly cold-blooded language of engineers and journalists covering this from some distance today, the structure of the building, which may not have been able to stand up to that fire, which was caused when those two planes, the first and the second, struck under somebody's control fairly high up in these superstructures, and then simply, as Robert Krulwich pointed out, and John Magnuson confirms, collapsed down upon themselves. And it was the president, we think. George Stephanopoulos is still with me. You were down there all today. It was the president, we think, who gave some clue to that which we have feared most of the day, that it wasn't hundreds of people involved in this, but thousands.
But thousands, yes. But Peter, I think, and I was thinking of this as John Magnuson was talking, when you talk about the strength of the building, in the coming days, we're also going to be hearing about some amazing, not only rescue stories, but survival stories. I spoke with the relative of someone who was on the 102nd floor of the first building today. After it took the hit from the airplane, that person still made it down from the 102nd floor and is home safe.
It's very interesting, because one of the lawyers who had come down from a lower floor believed that many people had got down in a fairly orderly fashion from some of the highest floors, at certainly right underneath where the attack had occurred, which has given people here, and I suspect in the country, some hope tonight that many more people get out of this building than we thought. It is now 9 o'clock Eastern Time. In the East, it is now 6 o'clock. On the West Coast, up and down the West Coast in the United States, it is about 12 hours, just 12 hours and a bit, since many of us walking to work were suddenly confronted with having to deal with this in one way or another. And there's a huge number of developments to catch up with. I want to go, first of all, as we just review this, because this all happened in the morning of Good Morning, right in the middle of at the very end of Good Morning America. Charles Gibson, Charlie Gibson, and Diane Sawyer were there on television live when this happened, and so it seems appropriate that we go to Diane, and Diane, ask you to put together some reconstruction of it for us.
Traffic helicopters were the first to report an explosion in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Witnesses say they saw it, a plane crashing into the building.
I saw something push the building in, and then I saw the tail, and then I saw flames.
Everybody else, let's go! Evacuation begins inside the building. Then, a few minutes later, just after 9 a.m., as smoke pours from the top of the North Tower, an unbelievable sight, a second plane hitting the South Tower.
Oh my God! Oh,
There are gaping holes in flames coming now from both towers. Witnesses see people screaming from the higher floors.
They're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
You see people jumping from the top of the World Trade Center.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the fire.
It was about 10 o'clock a.m. when the South Tower collapsed.
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way. What's happening?
On the ground, there's chaos. Flaming debris, someone said, like the dark side of the moon.
It was bad. It was like a dust storm or something. Like, I couldn't see anything.
About 20 minutes later, the second tower crumbles to the ground.
Oh my God, there it goes!
Symbols of New York, the World Trade Center towers, are simply gone.
Diane Sawyer giving us what it was like, at least from a distance, because we've all been at a distance from this, what it was like in those first moments. Now let's look at it from another perspective, because ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, as we've said several times today, is able, I think, to take you there, Lisa?
I am, Peter.
Lisa's in Seattle today, where she's been out of the Boeing company. It was Boeing jets, Boeing equipment, 757s and 767s involved. Why don't you just walk us through what you and we now know about how this unfolded from the point of view of the hijackers?
All right, I will, but Peter, I want to give you a little bit of new information first, if I may. There's a meeting going on, we understand, between the Federal Aviation Administration and the major carriers at this point. They are trying to determine how they might be able to get air service back up and going again tomorrow, what steps would need to be taken. We do understand from a number of sources that one of the things they are considering is a resumption of the Air Marshal program. That would be for armed air marshals that would actually fly on a number of flights. Now, that happens now in the United States, but it's a very small percentage of flights. It's unclear whether they would ramp up to every flight. That seems unlikely. But whether they are considering whether they would put air marshals on a number of flights as a precaution throughout the United States. One of the options that they are talking about.
Okay, just before you go to your chronology then, let me remind people that what you mean by air service back up is because hundreds of airplanes and thousands of passengers, an extraordinary job of air traffic control and pilots getting planes safely on the ground when the FAA decided everybody should land at the nearest possible airport, many of which are in Canada. And so there are thousands of people stranded far away from home tonight, safe. But when you refer to air service being got back up again, you basically mean getting the nation's air communication systems back up and running.
Absolutely. There's a national ground stop throughout the United States until at least noon tomorrow. It's going to be a massive task to get the system up and running. And obviously the main concern is to do it safely, to make sure that we don't have a repeat of the horrible events that we saw today. So there are security issues that are paramount, and there are also simply operational issues. How do you sort of turn the switch back on and get as many as 40,000 flights every day in the United States back in the air? And those discussions about that are underway right now, we understand.
We'll all follow that one. Now take us, if you would, through the movement of the aircraft which were ultimately and fatally involved.
What we know is that American Airlines Flight 11 was the first plane involved. That was the plane, a 767, en route from Boston's Logan Airport to Los Angeles. The plane took off shortly after 8 o'clock, we understand. About a half hour into the flight, it made a sharp left turn down towards New York. There were massive changes in airspeed, apparently, at that time. As the plane then headed toward Manhattan, it slowed and slammed into the World Trade Tower. It had been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, at the same time this was going on, there was a United Airlines 767, Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles. It also was in the air, taken over by hijackers. That plane made a turn towards New Jersey, then made virtually a U-turn and came up toward the Trade Tower from the south, came over Staten Island. It slammed into the second Trade Tower. It had also been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, before any of these planes actually hit the World Trade Center, a third plane, a United Airlines 757, I'm sorry, American Airlines 757. It was Flight 77 from Dulles had taken off. It was bound for Los Angeles as well. We don't know much about the flight path of that plane. We believe it was in the air about 1 hour before it hit the Pentagon. Then we have the fourth plane, United Flight 93, another 757 en route from Newark to San Francisco. We are unclear about the departure time. We have some conflicting information about that, whether it was close to 8 o'clock or closer to 8:45. It did depart Newark Airport. It appears that hijackers may have taken control of the plane over Cleveland. That is when it suddenly made a turn back toward the east. We also understand that sometime at that point, someone from the cockpit called the FAA and requested a change in flight plan. They said, we're not going to San Francisco. We want to go to Washington, D.C., to DCA, which is National Airport. It's unclear whether there was another Washington target, perhaps, that this plane was aiming for. Either way, it didn't make it all the way to Washington. It crashed in Pennsylvania. A total of 266 passengers and crew on all four of these planes. The toll could have been even much, much worse on the jetliners because they were very lightly filled. They can hold anywhere from 185 to 250 people. The most crowded plane had 90 passengers and crew members on it. Peter, we also want to mention, if we can, that as this was unfolding, people on board these planes were able to communicate what was going on. We know some details about that. We know on Flight 11, that was the American Airlines flight, the first one that hit the World Trade Tower, a flight attendant was able to call the American Airlines Operations Center. The flight attendant informed them that a number of flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had stormed the cockpit. She was also able to tell them, apparently, the seat number of at least one of the hijackers. She was able to give them that information. We also know that there were some cell phone calls from at least two of the other planes. There was a cell phone call, as you have reported earlier, from the plane that slammed into the Pentagon, a woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane. And we understand there was also a cell phone call on the United 175 flight. That was the other flight that hit the World Trade Tower. Apparently, a son on that plane called his father from his cell phone and also said there were hijackers on board with knives. So we do know that as the events were unfolding, what was going on 30,000 feet above the United States was being communicated. Of course, unfortunately, there was nothing the people on the ground could do about any of this except watch in horror as these planes ended up where they ended up.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa Stark, who has given us a very clear picture many times today on what precisely happened, or at least as much as we know of what happened. Thank you. On board those planes, we do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting onto sites on the web, which is a very good, vigorous way for people, very good way for people to communicate. Some of the things people have been telling us at ABC News, at abcnews.com, after today, nothing changes. Sorry, everything changes. Nothing will ever be the same. The way you've lived your life, enjoyed your freedom, your very personal expression, it all changes after today. From someone else, only a month ago, I laid on a bench outside the World Trade Center and marveled at what man could create, looking up at those 110 stories, and now I stare in disbelief at what man can take away. I want retribution, said one person to abcnews.com, and that's a sentiment that has been widely, deeply expressed in the heart of the political establishment in Washington and by people in every walk of life across the country. And as George Stephanopoulos and Leon Panetta, the former White House Chief of Staff, have made very clear, and the President clearly knows already, one of the things the President has to do is be patient and understand who it is who did this before the country can do anything by way of retaliation. is a slightly chilling one. If they can pull off an act like this, they are certainly capable of eventually sending nuclear weapons this way. And this is very interesting. How can people keep calling it the modern Pearl Harbor? At least we knew who we were up against back then. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a surprise to a great many Americans in the middle of afternoon ball games. This is the first time today that Major League Baseball has ever canceled all its games since D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in World War II. And one of the enormously frustrating things for the intelligence establishment, for the political establishment, for all of us in the country today, not to mention anyone else in the world who was a friend of the United States, perhaps even a foe, is to understand who it was who actually did this. And the reverberations from this are indeed global. Air traffic, we already know, listening to Lisa Stark and our own reporting earlier today, is snarled around the world, especially in Europe. The impact of what happens there in terms of transportation and commerce. The stock exchange was closed today. It all has an effect somewhere else. Any place there is a proposed mass gathering, in many parts of the world, they are rethinking it. In Germany, they have now canceled the Frankfurt car show, which is one of the biggest car shows, if not the biggest car show in the world. There's some consideration to canceling the Oktoberfest, the great beer and culture festival in Munich, in Germany. France has called a general security alert, and I'm just told that Ted Koppel is with us in London live. Ted has been in London and now can go even further than that, please, Ted, on telling us what's happened in Europe and as much as you know elsewhere.
Well, I must tell you, Peter, I've spent the better part of this day trying to get from where I was, which about 12 hours ago was in Italy, to where you are. And as you well know, and as you've been reporting for much of the day, getting into the United States from overseas is a very difficult task indeed. But it's just about, what time is it here? 2:15 in the morning here in London. And some of the early editions of the newspapers have come through, and I thought you might like to take a look at them. Let me hold them up. There's not a great deal that differentiates the tabloids today from the more serious newspapers. You can see it, Apocalypse, New York, September 11th, says the Daily Mail. Declaration of war, says the Daily Express. And then this one, which perhaps goes farther than it might, is this the end of the world, from the Daily Star? And so it goes. The Mirror, war on the world. The Sun, the day that changed the world. And now one of the more serious newspapers, the Independent, and again the same horrific pictures that we have been seeing all day long. And the Independent says, Doomsday America, the times of London when war came to America, and so it has gone. And I must tell you, Peter, the only thing I can tell you is, as you know, when we're overseas, American tourists tend to turn to folks like us, expecting that we know something. I'm afraid I knew less than they did. It was some other tourists who informed me earlier in the day of what had happened, and I went rushing back to my hotel room and packed while I was watching the television scenes that you have been reporting on all day. And all I can tell you is that this was a day when, as soon as people found out you were an American, they turned to you with expressions of grief, expressions of horror, expressions of outrage, and an offer to do anything they could do to help, which in my case meant getting a little bit closer to New York or Washington. Peter?
Ted, have you managed, I totally sympathize with what you've gone through today, and as bad as a day it is for many Americans, I understand what you mean when you say it's been a good day to be reminded that people around the world admire and sympathize with Americans, suffer with it. Can you give us some sense, if you have any whatsoever, just from looking at the reporting there, as to how governments are responding as well as individuals?
Well, again, Peter, and you've been in this situation often enough to be sympathetic to it. I literally just landed in London. We had to charter from Paris to get over here because flying into Heathrow wasn't that easy, especially at this time of night. And have only landed now and been reading the wires in the car coming in. And I do know that Tony Blair has expressed strong condemnation and, of course, a sense of oneness with the United States. Perhaps, Peter, the most interesting thing that I've heard, and just read a little bit of a transcript of a television newscast that came out of Tehran earlier this evening, is that the Iranian president, Khatami, is quoted by Iranian anchors earlier this evening as expressing his outrage and offering to help in any way that he can against this form of worldwide terrorism. Coming from Iran, that is quite remarkable, as I'm sure you know.
I do indeed, perhaps a little more understandable coming from President Khatami, who is regarded as the president of Iran, who, as you well know, is trying to move the country closer to some kind of sense of democratic representation than others in the country are willing him to do. But I think we've all known for a long time that sometimes elements within the Iranian political establishment or on the edges of the political establishment operate in ways that other parts of the political establishment are not aware of. Anyway, I won't...
Right. But no, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was just going to say, I don't want to impose on you anymore, because I know you want to, I know, like anybody else arriving on scene, you want to sit down and get as much as you can. So please come back to us at any time that you want. You want to add something now?
Just one thing, and I realize compared to what everyone has been going through in the United States today, and especially the citizens of New York and Washington, this seems like a small thing, but I'm sure it was reflected today thousands, if not tens of thousands of times. Being overseas and picking up the phone, I've got 3 youngsters, as you know, who live in New York City. Just trying to get through on the phone today could be such a trial. And 2 of my youngsters, 3 of them actually, work down in downtown New York. And all I can tell you is you stop being a newsman real fast, and all you want to do is be a father and find out that the kids are all right and that everything is okay. And for so many, many people today, Americans around the world, still wondering at this late hour what's happened to their loved ones. All I can tell you is the grief and the sympathy of the world goes out to all.
You're absolutely right, Ted. And as a man, as I just said this before we joined you, just got off the phone with at least one of his kids, and the other is trying to call him. I totally appreciate it. We'll let you go to work. Please come back anytime that you feel like it with news from overseas. But as Ted indicates, when he holds up the tabloids, sometimes known as the popular newspapers and the more serious broadsheet newspapers in Britain, they all have those same headlines that this strike on America has somehow changed things. And it's not as if the United States, in the wake of Oklahoma City, was not aware that it could happen on the American mainland. But they use phrases like apocalypse now in the movie sense, among other things, and just make you realize how deeply this has felt and what impact it's had in other parts of the world. It's interesting that it's interesting in a very minor way, that several people today have noted the oddity of the date, 9th day of the 11th month, as the 3 digits of the emergency number 911. George, I'll be with you in a minute, George Stephanopoulos. We've kept John McCarthy at the Pentagon, who's been frustrated, John, I think a little because they forced you to stay. Have they forced you to stay where you are and will not let you get into your normal listening post inside the Pentagon?
That's right. The security around the Pentagon is extreme. We have been allowed to get cameras a little closer on a very restricted basis, Peter. That was where we were able to take pictures of some of the bodies lined up outside the Pentagon, some of the grim evidence. You were talking about people worrying about their loved ones. Well, calls are going out from the Defense Department tonight of those bodies that have been identified. There are still many, many missing in the rubble of the Pentagon, so that search goes on tonight. You may notice behind me there are still fires burning on the roof of the Pentagon. They have been struggling all day to put out these fires, and they have moved along the rim of the Defense Department, and they break through. The firemen go up on the roof in very heroic efforts. They break through the roof. It breathes air, and that gives the fire new life, and then they pour water down those infernos as they burn. So the fight is still continuing here at the Pentagon to try and bring the fires under control so they can go after those people who are still trapped in the rubble.
John, we're looking at a second graphic. We had one earlier today which appeared to show that the depth or the width of the tragedy, not to mention the depth into that inner courtyard. And you described the great gash across the building as being, I think, about 200 feet wide. Is my sense tonight that fire has spread to places where you didn't anticipate it was going to spread earlier in the day?
There are fires that have spread along air ducts and along the very top attic section of the Pentagon, well beyond where the actual gash was. But Peter, the destruction, as the plane hit the Pentagon at an oblique angle, it dumped some of the fuel, apparently, in an explosive blast in one direction, and the damage is far, far worse on one side of the gash on the Pentagon than it is on the other.
And it looks to be the side on the right to our eye here. Am I right about that? Looked at from your perspective?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
John McCarthy, thank you very much indeed again. We're going to stay in the Washington area now because Claire Shipman, the House Intelligence Committee has just had a briefing, and I believe that Claire, you've managed to get a briefing from someone in the Intelligence Committee to tell us what went on.
News.
Hang on a sec, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can, now go ahead.
All right, sorry, trouble with my sound tonight. What we were told from Democratic and Republican leadership sources on Capitol Hill is that they had a briefing, an intelligence briefing, a little bit earlier today from members of the intelligence community, including the CIA, and that they were told, quote, the CIA had some hard facts, and of course this won't surprise you, that were pointing to Osama bin Laden. In fact, the source told me they were surprised how blunt the CIA was with them at this point. We've also been told, it's interesting, Peter, even in the midst of all of this tragedy today, that there was a little bit of grumbling in Washington. Some members of Congress frustrated that they weren't hearing from the president, that the president wasn't back in Washington, but the leadership says that they absolutely understand why the president was traveling around the country today, and that they have the scene we saw on Capitol Hill earlier of bipartisanship was not an act, that it's very genuine. The leadership was briefed 4 times by Vice President Cheney earlier today. They didn't hear from Bush directly, but they were very happy with what they heard from him tonight. They're planning to convene tomorrow to pass a piece of legislation condemning all of the terror, and then it's not clear whether or not they're going to stay in session. They're trying to decide how much sense that makes and how appropriate it is.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. We'll come back. We'll come back to you as the evening wears on. I know there are people in the country who will express this sentiment, so I express it as much on behalf of other people. We believe at this point we knew absolutely nothing in advance, and we've said that several, if not several dozen times today, and here we are within minutes, I shouldn't take that back, within hours of an incident involving terrorists about which we've heard not much throughout the day, and already we have someone in the Intelligence Committee, or maybe it's through a member of Congress, pointing the finger at Osama bin Laden. I'll turn to George Stephanopoulos to talk about this a little bit, and then perhaps to talk to our defense analysis in Washington in just a moment. Tony, the skeptics just say, oh, they point the finger at Osama bin Laden.
Because it's easy, and we need a face.
Exactly.
We need a face.
We need someone to demonize.
And someone to blame, and someone to demonize, and someone to attack. And I think there'll probably be some grumbling from the Central Intelligence Agency and others in the intelligence community that information like this was frankly leaked out of the House Intelligence Committee or out of the Congress, because that's one of their big complaints consistently with the Congress. Is one of the reasons we can't trust the Intelligence Committee with this information is because the minute we talk about it, it gets out in the public domain. But I do think it does speak to something that we'll see happening in the coming days.
Before you go on to the coming days, I apologize. I don't want to hold you up except this. Do you think, from your experiences in government, that there is a tendency to blame Osama bin Laden even when there is not necessarily any basis on which to precisely point the finger at him? I don't mean that Osama bin Laden gave money to someone in the country, but within hours of this, we're beginning to point at the same man we point to in almost every instance.
I would say a tendency to find a specific target that you can blame as quickly as possible, not necessarily Osama bin Laden. But I remember very well in early 1993, after former President Bush, there was an assassination attempt against him.
Right.
The FBI and the CIA spent several weeks trying to find out who was responsible. They finally did identify people, but there was an awful lot of pressure from the people on the ground, especially to say, yes, 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 we have it. And you felt that a lot of people further back in Washington were saying, Are you sure?
Yeah, I think the public is pretty actually wise about this now, because we've been through so many experiences where we thought it was Iran, and maybe it turned out to be Libya. We thought it turned out to be Libya, and then the suspect was Syria, and it turned out to be Palestine. Thought it was Palestinians, and it turned out to be an American.
And one other thing, not to discount, Peter, I'm not suggesting this is happening in this case, but you always have to be careful. Those who are doing the briefings may have an agenda of their own within the government trying to build pressure for an action they want.
Now, you were going to, before you go on to your other point, Claire Shipman mentioned that they were going to pass legislation tomorrow, which will be national legislation respectful of the day.
And support for the president.
And support for the president, and support for the various government agencies. There's very quickly going to be a demand and request for doing something more than already, and money.
For much more. And whenever you have these kinds of terrorist acts, whether it was Oklahoma City or the assassination attempt on President Bush or the Kobar Towers, Congress acts. Remember, after TWA Flight 800, we first got those questions that were asked of every air passenger. Have your bags been with you at all times? And has anyone else, have they ever been out of your sight? That was never asked before. You'll see something far more stringent, I would guess, coming out of Congress now. Far more attempts after the Oklahoma City bombing. There were attempts to increase the FBI's wiretapping capabilities and tracing gunpowder and other kinds of ammunition, and also after Al-Qaeda.
Because we have hundreds of kids and members of the public who routinely tour the Capitol building. All government offices are open and will be in full operation tomorrow. The last thing we want to do is to give any indication to the terrorists that they have succeeded in crippling local, state, or national government, and we need to demonstrate our strength as a country.
Governor, let me interrupt to say that our viewers are looking at video from New York, and just to make it absolutely clear, there has been no attack in any place other than New York and Washington, D.C.
And all the intelligence confirmation and discussions with federal security officials and our own law enforcement indicate that there are no known targets in the state of Washington. Nonetheless, we're doing everything we can to make sure that our roadways, our bridges are safe, and that the American and the Washington state public is being protected.
Well, part of the job of the State Patrol, Governor, was to inspect as many abandoned cars along state highways as possible. When will that particular job cease for the State Patrol?
Well, we're going to have to do this on a case-by-case basis. We're taking it a day at a time, and we're going to obviously be in communication with federal officials and taking advantage of whatever intelligence they are able to give us. But we want to make sure, that especially that our bridges, whether it's the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, Hood Canal, 520, 405, are not going to be targets in any way, and that obviously any abandoned vehicles on those major thoroughfares or bridges over the freeway or underneath the convention center on I-5, we have to be very, very careful and concerned about that.
Again, Governor, let me interrupt you again and point out that the video we're now looking at on King 5 is of the Rodney Davis ship, one of 3 patrolling Puget Sound, again, just as a precautionary measure, although, as you point out, all the military bases are on the highest stage alert in Washington State, correct?
That's correct. All military bases are on the highest state of alert, including the National Guard facilities. There is some traffic and trying to get everybody back to the bases, but we're coordinating everything between the State Patrol, local law enforcement, and the military. These are precautions. We need to do everything we can to make sure that our citizens are safe and protected. And while there's no indication that any place, facility in the state of Washington is a target, we owe it to our citizens to go the extra mile.
And we are assured by that. I'm wondering how long, though, the State Emergency Operations Center is up and running on alert, or do you take it on a day-by-day basis?
Again, we have to take it on a day-by-day basis. It's also a useful function for local governments and state agencies, so that there's one central place that people can receive information as well as provide information. So it's a very, very valuable service. And again, everybody is doing everything they can to make sure that government operations are as normal as possible and that we're protecting the people of the state of Washington.
All right, Governor Gary Locke reporting to us from Olympia. We thank you for joining us here on King 5 News. And as we say goodbye to you, we point out once again the ship you were looking at is the Rodney Davis, one of 3 patrolling Puget Sound as a precautionary measure. It's 6:30. You probably would have just been tuning in to watch the 6:30 edition of King 5 News. We're on a special 2-hour edition of King 5 News to update you on the response in America to the attacks on the World Trade Towers and the attack on the Pentagon today, a coordinated and devastating attack on America.
We will continue our coverage until 7 o'clock, at which time on both King 5 and KOMO 616. NBC will resume coverage from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock, when at that point we'll be back with another special edition of King 5 News from 10 o'clock until midnight. I want to go to Darren Watkins, who's live at McCord Air Force Base. And Darren, we're waiting. Has the plane taken off that is containing, I believe, 62 search and rescue personnel from our area that will do some help in New York?
No, it hasn't taken off yet. Right now, rather quiet, you might say, but this really is going to be the calm before the storm here at McCord Air Force Base. You know, the attack may have been on the East Coast, but here tonight, volunteers, soldiers, airmen, they have now all stepped into action.
He's trained to find people in collapsed structures.
This is Shadow, one of several search dogs from our region on standby, waiting for word to board these military planes for the East Coast. Destination unknown.
We don't know whether we're going to New York or Pentagon or exactly where we're going, but we do know we're going.
Security has been tightened with all but a few gates still open at both Fort Lewis and McCord Air Force Base. That triggered a massive traffic backup. State troopers split their time between easing congestion and checking for explosives.
And what we're trying to do is check out the abandoned and disabled vehicles to make sure they aren't suspicious or there's nothing up with that.
While today's focus is on tightening up security, both civilians and soldiers now gear up for what will happen next.
This morning's events have been a shocking reminder to all of us of the dangers we face in the world today.
Have you thought much about the mission at hand?
It's hard not to think about that.
It gave me a real sinking feeling, knowing that there were people that perished, many, many people.
Now, the latest word, the McCord flights could go out either later tonight or first thing tomorrow. Efforts are underway now to take the volunteers, the search and rescue teams back east. Also, we are being told that Fort Lewis has now prepared a large medical shipment they hope to load on board, as well as people here in the Northwest have just begun to answer the call to help. Live at McCord, I'm Darren Watkins.
All right, Darren, thank you.
Darren, every time an emergency such as this occurs, there is really increased security around places like McCord and Fort Lewis. In all your times of covering news in Western Washington, have you seen security this tight?
No, this is the tightest. Remember back there when the USS Cole attack happened? They did reach parts of the protocol called Condition Delta, the highest level of security here, but never has it been at this level of Delta in the 20-odd years or so that I have been covering military in the Northwest.
Darren Watkins live at McCord Air Force Base.
Darren, thanks. Now, the shutdown of the borders not only stopped air and road traffic, but it stopped boat traffic, too, which included stopping the Port Angeles-Victoria ferry just as a precaution.
King 5's Alan Schaufler joins us tonight with reaction from Port Angeles, where border agents, as you recall, just 2 years ago arrested a terrorist. Alan.
Well, Gene and Dennis, the Olympic Peninsula here in Western Washington has certainly felt the sting, the threat of terrorism. You remember that happening just before the new year in 1999. And again today, some shudders in the city of Port Angeles as they dealt with today's events back east, the impact here, and look back as well to what happened nearly 2 years ago.
A huge backup at the ferry dock in Port Angeles. Passengers waiting for an overdue boat, the Black Ball Line's Coho. Today, the run across the Strait of Juan de Fuca from Victoria delayed nearly 2 hours, with Canadian customs officials taking extra care, searching vehicles and people.
They checked all of us real good, all the cars, suitcases, purses.
They were raising the hoods of cars. They were making everybody take baggage, open the bags, and they were going through them very, very carefully.
It's a frightening flashback for people in this city and at this ferry dock. It was here that convicted terrorist Ahmed Rassam was caught with explosives, likely on his way to bomb West Coast targets. He was trapped and finally tackled by customs agent Mike Chapman, now a Clallam County commissioner.
We stopped at active terrorism here at our port, but it wasn't on the scale of flying an airplane into a building. I mean, that's a whole nother level of terrorism and a whole nother level of violence and destruction.
And we understand that many people, many Americans who were visiting in Canada, immediately this morning when they heard what was going on, got on the boat, got in lines to come back. That may have also contributed to that backup in Victoria and the Coho being nearly 2 hours late getting into the dock at Port Angeles. Here at Coleman Dock in Seattle, people lining up, waiting for the milk run to Bainbridge Island, the end of not quite another day. In Seattle, I'm Alan Schaufler, King 5 News.
All right, Alan, thank you.
Well, the horrible events of today seem impossible for all of us as adults to comprehend. So what about the children who no doubt have heard or will hear about these attacks? How should we as parents talk to our children about the horror? King 5's Julie Francavilla talks to the experts about how best to help your children deal with this day.
Unthinkable images brought into our homes by TV. They're tough to watch and even more difficult to even try to understand. These are exactly the heartbreaking images that Seattle mom Nancy Hirsch and her children have come to this Seattle park to escape. Even though Nancy's son Alex is only 2.5 years old, she knows with time more questions will come up about this regrettable day.
As he gets older and people refer to this incident today, we'll explain to him that where we were and that we watched it together and that we weren't together when this horrible accident happened.
So what can parents do to talk to their children about the horrible tragedy they may have seen on TV or talked about today? Child counselors say one of the best things that parents can do is make sure their children feel safe.
Children need a lot of reassurance during this time, physical reassurance, hugs, letting them know that as your parents, you're there, they're safe with you, you're going to do everything you possibly can.
More advice from the experts. Be calm and reassuring when talking with your children. Give them the facts, but don't speculate. Encourage your kids to talk about their concerns. Realize children from toddlers to teenagers may be affected emotionally. And expect even more questions to come from your children with time, as the extent of the loss of life out of this unthinkable tragedy is revealed.
Wish we didn't have that in our lifetime, but I'm afraid we do.
In Seattle, Julie Francavilla, King 5 News.
If you'd like more information on how to talk to your children about the tragic events of today, you can call the King County Crisis Clinic. The numbers are here on your screen. In Seattle, call 206-461-3222. And outside the Seattle area, call toll-free at 1-800-244-5767.
Today's tragedy also obviously having an effect on the sports world, although today it might not seem as significant as the other events we've been talking to you about all day.
Now, college football and the pennant races are a little more than an afterthought today. Kimmy Takei has a look at what's on the sports horizon over the next few days.
The Mariners could have clinched the American League West tonight, but that will have to wait. For the first time since D-Day in 1944, a whole day of regular season play wiped out. Commissioner Bud Selig saying he didn't know when play would resume. Selig adds, in the interest of security and out of a sense of deep mourning for the national tragedy that has occurred today, all Major League Baseball games for today have been canceled. I will continue to monitor the situation on a daily basis and make ongoing decisions accordingly. In the past, baseball has been a healing force during national tragedies. Franklin Roosevelt ordered games to continue during World War II. And when an earthquake hit San Francisco during the 1989 World Series, the city asked baseball to keep playing. Selig hopes baseball will help heal again. The NFL, which was criticized for playing after President Kennedy's assassination, says it isn't sure what it will do with this weekend's games yet. The Seahawks say they'll hear from the league within 24 to 48 hours. In college football, decisions will be made school by school or conference by conference. The Huskies have decided not to play their game at top-ranked Miami this weekend. The Dogs say some things are much bigger than football.
It brings you very quickly to deal with the reality that what we do is, while we love to think of it as all important, and it is in the molding of young people and the lessons that we think the game teaches, it is not a very big player when it comes to these kind of human dramas that are unfolding before our eyes.
A whole lot of stuff happened this morning that's kind of puts things in perspective as far as like a lot of people's lives and are going to be changed forever. And keep in mind, we're just playing a game, man. You know, that's what it is.
As for the Cougars, Wazoo officials will announce tomorrow the status of their game scheduled for this Saturday with Colorado. A couple of other postponements. Game 1 of the Rainiers' PCL championship game against New Orleans is delayed. The PGA moved Thursday's start of the World Golf Championship to Friday. and today's U.S. Women's Cup soccer doubleheader has been canceled.
And Olympic officials say security for the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City will be completely reevaluated. Mitt Romney, the president of the Salt Lake Organizing Committee, says a $200 million security plan is no longer adequate. So
that's hard to believe that money can't buy safety, at least that much money in terms of what's going to happen in Salt Lake City.
That's right, but it obviously proved it today that money cannot buy security anywhere, whether it's at the Olympics or at the World Trade Center.
Obviously, sports provides a welcome diversion. Sometime I'm sure that very few people are willing to think about diversions at this point, but the Huskies are thinking about when they play. The Mariners have certainly lost a lot of momentum by not playing.
Right. We all know it's only a game, as Larry Triplett said, but Barbara Hedges did say today that the Huskies and Miami game will be rescheduled. The first available date would be the weekend after Thanksgiving, so it would be the weekend after the Apple Cup weekend. So we'll see when that rescheduling takes place, but Barbara Hedges did say that they would reschedule that.
You're around professional ball players all the time. I'm wondering what you might think, what they're thinking, how they might view their jobs in light of today's tragedy.
The ones I was around today were the Huskies, and they were all very together in the fact that this is just a game, that they are all young guys who are interested in politics and interested in what their future holds, and this is obviously what their future holds as well. So they were more politically active and politically minded than you might have thought. They were much more interested in what was happening in the world than what was happening on the field. I don't think they could have cared less what was happening on the field today.
Like everyone, and as one of the students in the high school where we visited today said, you know, this is a difficult time to be an 18-year-old thinking about graduating from high school.
Yeah.
And for college students, it's an equally difficult, challenging, but perhaps an opportunity to learn about your place in the world.
Yeah, and these guys were all saying that, you know, this was the time that they were all college-age kids, they were big football players, but they wanted to talk to their moms today. They thought that was the most important thing, to call home and make sure everything was still kosher with that. So.
Well, you tell them we want to talk to them, too. Kimmy, thank you.
Thank you, Kimmy. Well, there was weather today. It was beautiful outside, although I don't think we saw the beauty as we normally would at this time of year.
One of the things that spoke to us, Jeff, was even satellite map transmission was interrupted today, partly because the picture just wasn't there, partly because the internet lines weren't available.
Well, I think certainly no amount of sunshine could overcome the darkness of today's events, but it is a reminder that life does go on, however difficult that may seem at times. Let's go to our latest series of satellite pictures, and as I put it in motion, we'll see that there are really two disturbances. One just to the west, that's going to contribute a few high clouds tomorrow. The other moving through southern Oregon, that could bring some clouds, particularly to the southeastern part of the state. So here's a look at the forecast. Overnight lows tonight for the most part in the mid-40s to low 50s, a little bit milder in the central part of Puget Sound, and some areas of fog developing overnight tomorrow morning. As I mentioned, maybe a few high clouds drifting through, and high temperatures for the most part in the 70s, mildest in central and southern Puget Sound. Needless to say, as is typical with this sort of pattern, even a little bit warmer in some of the eastern suburbs, 78 for example in Bellevue, 83 in the Portland-Vancouver area. On the other side of the Cascades, your highs probably well up into the 80s, including 88 degrees in Moses Lake. Now, as far as winds are concerned, those are going to pick up a little bit, strongest through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, moderate through the Puget Sound area, about 5 to 20. And if we take a look up in the mountain passes, mostly sunny skies, highs in the upper 60s to mid-70s. In the 5-day outlook, we're beginning to see some shifts. Thursday, a few more low morning clouds and afternoon sunshine. Friday, warmer. Saturday, some increasing high clouds, and then Sunday, increasing clouds. And it looks likely, and I haven't had to say this in a long time, that we could see some rain developing either Sunday night or Monday during the day. So do as much within the framework of what has occurred. Enjoy the sunshine as much as possible. It is going to change.
Jeff, thanks. Must say we missed it today.
Yes. We got there somewhere.
Glenn Farley has been covering from his vantage point as our local aviation expert the crashes, all 4 of the hijacked planes, and joins us now with some late-breaking information. Glenn?
Yes, Gene, we understand that 4 Boeing employees leaving Washington, D.C. for San Francisco on board that American Airlines plane that ended up in the Pentagon were apparently on board that jet and obviously presumed dead. We also know Boeing has confirmed that those 4 employees were from Boeing facilities in Southern California, not from Puget Sound. It is not believed that there were any Boeing employees on the other planes involved, the other 3 planes involved in today's hijacking. But again, Boeing has confirmed that 4 employees, all based in Southern California, were on American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco that ended up crashing into the Pentagon. Again, that confirmation just in. And it's Glenn Farley reporting live from the newsroom.
Glenn, do we have any word when the passenger manifests from all those planes might be made public?
No, we don't, and that may be the easier part in all of this in trying to figure out exactly who was where. Obviously, 266 people were on board all 4 of these airplanes that were crashed. We are not sure, again, don't have any idea how many people were killed in the World Trade Center, potentially thousands. Hopefully, I would imagine we may see some sort of a passenger manifest tomorrow. I think one of the things here that we don't normally see in a regular airplane crash that's an accident is the fact that the FBI is involved. They are now controlling the investigation, so we're not quite sure how quickly those names will be released.
Glenn Farley live in the newsroom. We've talked about how officials around the state have meant to safeguard all of our safety. Today, the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as the Port of Seattle, scrambled to protect its buildings and terminals along the waterfront. King 5's Roberto Romero tells us despite the extra security, it was business as usual.
Members of the U.S. Coast Guard stretched barbed wire across its entry. Concrete diversions were placed along the driveway, and everyone who wanted in had to be searched first.
Our role right now is concerned specifically with our own protection, and right now we have heightened security on the base.
The Port of Seattle monitored their ports and terminals. 2 ships had arrived in Seattle early this morning. They were cleared and unloaded, and the cargo was sent on its way. While work continued along the shore, a Port of Seattle building was evacuated and closed. The World Trade Center in Seattle houses 14 consulate offices, as well as conference rooms. Everyone was told to go home.
And it was closed really as a precautionary measure because of the target in New York, of course, the high-profile target there, and I think to some degree out of a sense of sensitivity.
The extra security is something the Port of Seattle can easily handle. What officials are even more concerned about is the long-term effects of this horrible terrorist act. That's because 2 of the world's largest port offices, the Port of New York and the Port of New Jersey, had maritime offices at the World Trade Center. At this point, officials have no idea what the impact will be locally or worldwide. In Seattle, Roberto Romero, King 5 News.
At least 6 more ships are expected into Elliott Bay today and early tomorrow. At this point, they will be allowed to berth after a customary U.S. Coast Guard inspection.
Deb Feldman has been joining us from the Puget Sound Blood Center all day today, where an outpouring of compassion and generosity, and with a need to do something positive today, many people have shown up at the Blood Center, waiting as many as 3 or 4 hours to make their donations. Deb?
Well, actually, that estimate was boosted a short while ago. It turns out people have actually been waiting in line now closer to 6 hours. If you can see, there's really no one behind me. That's because about half an hour ago, they decided to send people home who are waiting outside, because even once inside, that wait can easily be 2 to 3 hours. So I'll show you a picture of what it looked like inside there a short while ago, and still currently right now. People are donating blood. I've been told that the Puget Sound blood centers have collected about 2,000 pints of blood today. Normally 700 would be considered a good day. The people who were sent home were asked to please come back tomorrow, and in the days that follow, they say this is not a one-day need for blood. This will be something that will be continued over the next days and weeks, as people who are injured will need surgeries and the like. So what I can tell you is that the hours here tomorrow as well as Thursday are expected to be extended from 10 a.m. until 8 p.m. There will also be mobile units. They say they need all types of blood types, in particular O positive and O negative. So at this point, they have sent home the people who are waiting outside. The wait would have been just too long for those folks. Just working on the people inside the doors right now. They could still be there another hour or two. Jean Dennis?
Deborah, is there any way for people who want to give blood to call the blood center and perhaps reserve a time to come down, or is it simply a matter of going down to the blood center and spending your time in line?
Absolutely. There is a number to call, and that is preferable, they say, for the coming days. Now, they have a toll-free number. That number is 1-800-398-7888. They also have a web page that if you go to king5.com and click on our news links, we should have a link there so that you can check out the status there. I'm not sure if you can reserve an appointment online. Certainly, though, you are encouraged to call. They say to make an appointment, cut down on your own wait, and also so that they can try and estimate staffing for the next couple of days.
All right, Deb Feldman at the Puget Sound Blood Center, thanks for that very useful information.
Well, first the unbelievable as planes slam into the World Trade Center. Minutes later, a surreal sight as each tower collapses.
The aftermath of that calamity was captured by news photographers, and this is what one photographer endured.
I'm seeing a couple of clean breaths.
That's good. Okay.
Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Who are you?
Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here. At this semi-staging area. See if I can help. That's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, it seems that people who needed oxygen from the dust. There was one trauma.
One photographer's intense reaction, one of millions of reactions today. As we end this portion of our continuing coverage, we at King 5 want to close with some thoughts about our need to be united in these United States. As Senator John Warner said, this is the worst time in U.S. history, but it can also be our finest hour. It is definitely a test of our nation's character. We must be united, not intimidated by these attacks on our democracy. And just as Winston Churchill took hope from chimney smoke above London's rubble, we can take strength from each other, ready to stand together and to protect the freedoms provided by generations who went before us. The same freedom that makes us vulnerable to today's attacks is also our nation's strength, the strength to cope, the strength to endure, to see justice done, and the strength to move forward. And in the meantime, all of us need to be prepared to do whatever it is we can, no matter how large or how small, to address the needs of the victims and the needs of their loved ones. And for all of them, let's resolve to never again take any of our precious freedom for granted.
Well said.
A day filled with emotion for all of us, a day none of us will ever forget.
We leave you tonight with some of the images that have defined this day in history.
Second hijacked plane on the way to Washington.
Smoke continues to pour out of the area.
The fire is spreading now. We can see complete. Oh my God, it's inside the first building.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
Some time that there were groups planning this, and obviously we didn't do enough. You can best control what's going on and monitor it and make decisions.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested.
Down
a lot of people were caught outside. The smoke got into their...
Horrible, horrible tragedy.
People evacuating, streams of people. Perhaps in some way all of our lives have been changed today.
And guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that.
Mayor Rudy Giuliani, ironically, this was to be the day in which there was going to be a mayoral primary to try to determine the candidates who would be replacing him. His term limits are up. He's been at once an extraordinarily popular and effective and controversial mayor in New York City, and obviously he is on top of the job here tonight, and he is saying an exceptional statement: stay home tomorrow, stay out of New York City, the busiest city in the world. But it's a day that the city is going to need to be directing all of its efforts on rescue efforts that are downtown in the World Trade Center area, and a lot of the services simply will not be available. All schools are closed here tomorrow. The financial markets are closed as well. NBC's Dan Abrams is down near where that search and rescue effort is underway, and he's with a New York City police official. Dan?
Well, that's right, Tom. Where I'm standing is sort of the gateway to the rescue effort. Literally lines of police cars, fire trucks, ambulances going down the road here to the Trade Center, which is about half a mile away. I'm joined by Detective Ron Brandt, who's been back there for the last 11 hours. Detective, what have you been doing there, and what have you seen?
Just when we first got here, originally we mobilized here, and just trying to help out and get people off the streets and just helping wherever we can.
For the last 5 hours, 6 hours, what has the rescue effort been? How's that been going?
Just trying to get to see if there's people around, and just trying to call out going into subways, and just trying to see if there's anybody that we can help out.
How would you characterize the scene back there now?
It's words I guess can't describe it. Never seen anything in my 14 years. I've never seen anything like it, quite like it. Hopefully I'll never see anything like it again.
Detective, thank you. Tom, I want to bring in Captain Kenner from the Fire Department of New York, who is one of the people who's been back there. Captain, thank you for taking the time. Tell us what you have been doing there. You seem to be covered in soot.
Just I've never seen such carnage. Right now, you have some heavy cranes, payloaders, lifting heavy steel beams and all, and doing search and rescue operations. Quite a bit of devastation over there.
When you say search and rescue operations, what exactly is that involving?
Well, we're looking if there are any survivors I try and ID what we can, and basically lift some of the heavy building off. As you know, 2 buildings came down and another 60-story building collapsed. It's nothing like you could ever imagine. So we have some big payloaders and cranes, and we're going into the operation. Commissioner's over there. We just walked out now after about 10 hours, and we'll be going back in a little while. So everybody's working very hard and doing the best we can.
Have you found survivors? I mean, a lot of the firefighters who are coming out are saying to me, look, this is a recovery effort. Have you been finding them?
No survivors so far. So sad to say, quite a few victims, but no survivors so far.
And again, when you say quite a few, can you give us a little bit more specifics about what you've been seeing back there?
You'd have to ask the command post. They have an overall view. We were in small pockets in certain areas doing our searches, so I could, knowing what we found, and I'd really rather not say what type of numbers, but I know the command post would have the overall figures.
Finally, what is the state of the building right now? How would you characterize it?
Non-existent, gone. So, both towers and a 60-story building next to it. So totally collapsed into each other.
Okay. Thank you very much, Captain Kenner. We appreciate it. Tom, back to you.
They don't call them New York's finest for nothing. Those are really heroic efforts that are underway tonight in the lower end of Manhattan, and they will go on all through the night as they have all day long. The New York City Firefighters Union saying they believe that they lost at least 200 firemen when those buildings came down, and the toll, as we have been saying repeatedly, I know you may be tired of hearing it, we simply don't know how high it may go. At one point today, the president used the phrase, thousands dead. It could very well go into the thousands. 2,400 people were killed when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor 60 years ago this year. This attack on America, this terrorist war in America, could be more consequential in terms of lives lost, and it could be as well consequential in other ways in terms of getting this country involved around the world. Pearl Harbor, of course, triggered World War II, one of the epic events in the history of mankind. This is not expected to do just that, but it will change this country in so many ways. Let's go to Robert Bazell now, who has been at St. Vincent's Hospital for much of the day. It's one of the hospitals that are very near the World Trade Center, first-rate medical facility, and they have been taxed beyond their belief, I would guess. Robert?
Yes, Tom, in the last hour or two, the number of ambulances coming in here has gone down to a trickle, and we understand from hospital officials that's because rescue workers have hit some kind of a hot spot, possibly a gas line or something like that, that's made them have to stop the search and rescue operations. But to get the latest numbers from the hospital, I'm going to bring in Mark Ackerman, who is a deputy administrator of St. Vincent's Hospital, been here all day. Mr. Ackerman, you had an emergency plan here in place. You were the lead hospital for the 1993 World Trade explosion. How well were your people prepared today?
Bob, I think we're very well prepared. Unfortunately, St. Vincent's has been in the epicenter of a number of these types of incidents, and we have preparedness drills throughout the year, so we are quite ready.
What are the latest numbers of casualties that you have here now?
St. Vincent's here in Manhattan has received 327 patients thus far. 62 of them are in critical condition.
How are we doing with that?
55 of those individuals are firefighters or police officers, and 3 of our patients have passed away.
Now, that's a lot of casualties, but it's nothing compared to what we thought we would see when we got here this morning.
It's really very upsetting to our entire staff. We really, in the beginning, had been told to expect up to 1,000 patients, and I think the realization is coming to all of our physicians and nurses that we were the hospital that received the most patients, and that really only means that there are still many, many people down under that rubble.
Now, you have some personal tragedies here as well as the people that are coming in. You had a nurse who was communicating with her husband. Tell me that story.
One of our nurses in our comprehensive cancer center, husband was up on a very upper floor. She heard about the airplane. She emailed her husband. They were talking back and forth, and then the email stopped, and she found out that the building had collapsed and realized that her husband had gone down with it. So it's a real tragedy from that perspective. A number of our nurses are married to firefighters and police officers, and they've been working hard all day, knowing in the back of their minds that their loved ones may be among the casualties.
There's some terrible stories here, Tom, and I think that we're going to find out that this is going to continue on in the next few days, although certainly not at the rate that we saw it today. And I think from talking to the Dan Abrams, talking to the firefighter officials, they're talking about the magnitude of the rescue efforts, huge steel beams. It is the bodies and the victims, the injured, will continue to come in, but at a much lower rate. Tom?
Ask Mr. Ackerman for us quickly, if you could, Robert, whether they have enough medical personnel, doctors and trained nurses and so on.
Mr. Ackerman, are there enough doctors? Do you have the staff you need to deal with whatever contingencies come up?
We do. We had over 500 physicians and nurses on duty, or people that came in from their days off. There was a convention of physicians in town here. As a matter of fact, we had people from Europe come and offer their assistance. And in fact, ultimately, we ended up turning people away because so many wonderful New Yorkers and people from around the world volunteered their services.
And there was also an amazing sight here today. At one point, the hospital had asked for blood, and the number of donors who were spilling onto the street here was so great, within just minutes of the first announcement, that you had to turn them away.
We did. Actually, we had over 800 people in line at one point. The mayor happened to come at that moment and said, "What do you need?" And we said, "We have people we have to ship to other blood centers." And we had 10 city buses here in a matter of moments. Those 800 people were brought around the city to donate blood in other places.
And you have enough beds to handle all the people that have come in and all the people that will be coming in the next hours?
We do. We have 2,600 beds in the St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Center system, 800 beds here in Manhattan. We were able to send many of our patients to our other hospitals, and they will be ready now with beds here in Manhattan in the event we get many more patients overnight.
Thank you very much, and great job here by many, many doctors and nurses, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, Bob Bazell. St. Vincent's, one of New York's premier hospitals in lower Manhattan, not too far from the World Trade Center, or what used to be the World Trade Center. You can only imagine what it was like in the nation's capital today. First, the news that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane, then a second plane had hit the other tower. That, of course, conjured up immediate visions of that this was some kind of a terrorist attack. Then the Pentagon was hit by a hijacked airliner. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was in his office at the time. It penetrated 2 of the rings of that fortress-like building. The fires continue to burn there tonight. There was a code red on Capitol Hill. That meant that House Speaker Dennis Hastert, who was third in line of succession, had to be taken to a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor to the president, was on the phone to him. He was at a literacy event in Florida, and she told his staff that they then suspected terrorism as a result of the second attack. She went to the operations room in the White House with Vice President Dick Cheney. Colin Powell turned around on a trip to Lima and started back for the United States. What kind of a day was it for the rest of the day in the nation's capital? Here's NBC's Nora O'Donnell with a report on this day that will be remembered for so long, for so many terrible reasons.
Get all these people across the street, please.
Moments after the attack on New York, the chaos spread to the nation's capital.
So what looked to be maybe a 20-passenger corporate jet, no markings on the side, coming in at a shallow angle like it was landing right into the side of the Pentagon. And then a huge fireball, perhaps 5 times the height of the Pentagon.
The terrorist target was the nerve center of the United States military. An explosion ripped through the building that since World War II has symbolized America's power.
And we heard this boom, the building shook, the ceiling tiles fell out of the ceiling, and we ran out. We kind of dazed, grabbed our hard hats, ran out, and there was just smoke. People were screaming, "Run, what is it, what is it?"
Let's run! Get on the other side!
As firefighters rushed to put out the flames, America learned that the Pentagon had indeed taken a direct hit, not from a corporate jet, but from another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77, en route from Washington's Dulles Airport to Los Angeles. 58 passengers and 6 crew members were aboard. There may have been as many as 100 more people killed or injured inside the building. Dozens were rushed to area hospitals, yet to be accounted for, others that may still be left in the smoldering rubble.
Here in Washington, D.C., we are at threat condition Delta.
Washington, D.C., now in the crosshairs of terrorism. The military was ordered to its highest state of alert. And at the White House, the Secret Service received a credible threat of a terrorist act.
got to be off the grounds and inside the building.
A fourth hijacked plane that crashed 80 miles outside Pittsburgh is believed to have been headed for an attack on Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. The president wasn't in town, but Vice President Cheney was. He and key aides were whisked out of the West Wing and into a secure location, while other White House staffers were evacuated under the watch of Secret Service agents armed with machine guns.
We've had some reports about intrusions of airspace, which caused us to be concerned enough to recess the House of Representatives subject to the call of the chair.
At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the U.S. Capitol and Supreme Court, lawmakers and justices were forced from the seat of American democracy.
I think, in a sense, it is unfortunately a unique experience in American history.
And I characterize it as a man who lived through World War II, as a young sailor at the end of the war. It's another Pearl Harbor for this country.
By 10 a.m., all federal offices were closed, sending the government's entire workforce into the clogged streets to try to make their way home. For tourists, museums and monuments were shut down as well. Washington was in a frenzy. Hospitals in emergency mode, roads shut down, bridges closed, fighter jets patrolling the skies. The mayor declared a state of emergency.
That all of our emergency agencies are fully deployed to meet any emergencies that might arise.
The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow.
Later, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, stepped up to the Pentagon podium to state the horrible truth everyone already knew.
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America.
What kind of world do we live in? This is terrible. It's just awful.
Tonight, Washington is a ghost town. This is the Memorial Bridge, normally crowded with traffic. Yet the attack has succeeded in shutting down the capital of the United States and left Americans wondering, how could it have happened in this of all cities?
The White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon are symbols of America.
Counterterrorism forecaster Marvin Citron authored a report in 1994 for the Department of Defense, warning of Washington's vulnerability to terrorist attack.
We predicted a plane could have crashed into the Pentagon. That's about as specific as you can be. If you made a right turn at the Washington Monument, you could hit the Pentagon. A left turn, you could hit the White House.
He advised back in 1994 that air traffic be controlled over and around all federal buildings, but he says this recommendation was not implemented.
People are wondering today how the Pentagon, which is a symbol of America's military power, could be hit by a plane. How could that happen?
Because we're a free society. The balance you've got in the United States is access and freedom to complete security.
Despite heightened security after the Oklahoma City bombing and barriers at the White House, Citron says Washington became complacent about protecting itself.
We've let down. We strengthened ourselves during Oklahoma because the crisis was there. We were in a crisis mode. Once we get rid of that mode, we go back to laissez-faire.
But is it even possible to protect Washington, a symbol of democracy, but also the nucleus of the country's power?
You cannot defend against this kind of an attack. The Pentagon is just one more Washington office building. That's all it is. It's not a fortress.
Noel Cook is a former Pentagon counterterrorism chief. Just this June, he authored a report warning that an attack of this kind was imminent. Now he says the nation has to face the reality of terrorism in our own backyard.
What's emotionally gripping is the feeling that this thing has come home to roost in a major way. We are vulnerable in ways that we never were prepared to admit to ourselves, and we're going to have to cope with that.
Marvin Citron concurs. He predicts a city under siege.
I think people are going to be more looking around. It'll look more like Israel. The people there are accustomed to attacks from terrorists, and they're prepared, and they look for things. We'll do more of the same thing.
The first step for now, a show of determination by President Bush, who returned to the White House at the end of a tragic day, hoping to allay the fears of a stunned and terrified nation.
That's Nora O'Donnell, who covers Congress for NBC News and Washington in general. The D.C. Police Chief Charles Ramsey said tonight, nothing in Washington, D.C., your nation's capital, is likely to be the same again. That's the police chief of that city. But as far as security is concerned, there's no longer any such thing, he said, as business as usual. Already Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House had been closed down. There had been some talk about reopening that. That talk will disappear in a heartbeat as a result of this attack on the Pentagon today and the terrorist attacks up here in New York City. What goes on in a cockpit when there's the kind of chaos that we witnessed here today? Well, someone who knows a lot about cockpit chaos in a flight that is in a distressed mode is Al Haynes. He was the man who was at the controls of that United Airlines flight in July 1989 and made that heroic, controlled crash landing in Sioux City, Iowa, and saved so many lives with his heroic action. Let's talk to you, Mr. Haynes. You were not being hijacked at the time, obviously, but what it must have been like in that cockpit. You had to be thinking about that today as you watched all these images.
Yeah, Tom, I can't imagine what that crew went through. I have to believe, like everybody else has been saying all day, that the crew only had control of the airplane from the very beginning, and after that it had to be someone else. No crew would do what those people did.
Yeah.
What they went through had to be terrible.
And they were obviously very sophisticated, the hijackers, because they knew enough to turn off the transponder so no one could track their flight.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. They did turn the transponder off.
Yes. And if
well, that would be...
Go ahead.
Excuse me, they can track them by the blip, but they would have just a blip to follow, and it'd be very difficult for the controllers, I would think, to follow. Yeah.
What are the procedures in a cockpit if you are being hijacked? How are you trained as a pilot?
Well, you have several different things you can do. One is you do send out a transponder code, but obviously they knew better than that. And that's about it. There's not much else you can do. You send the transponder code, and if they won't let you transmit on the radio, then you're just there, and that's all there is to it.
Is there any other way to send a secret signal to air traffic controllers that you're being hijacked?
Not unless you use a transponder. Other than that, there's really no way to contact them other than by radio. If they know enough to turn the transponder off, I'm sure they won't let you talk.
Once you get airborne in a 757 or whatever these planes were today, how difficult would it be for someone to remove the pilot from the chair and take the controls and fly it as precisely as they did into the Pentagon and into the World Trade Center?
Well, I would just guess here, speculation, that once they're in the cockpit, they probably know enough to put it on autopilot. They put it on autopilot, then they pull the crew out of the seats by either executing them or making them unconscious, and then they can get back in and fly. But first it would go on autopilot, so the airplane would be under control while they were doing this. And they probably know enough to do that, evidently, if they know enough to turn off the transponder. That'd be a guess anyway.
Yeah, but they made a hard left turn when they left Boston, according to the blip that we were able to follow on the tracking tape, and then they were able to make a couple of banking turns at low altitude here over Manhattan, and I think that there was at least one report that they did the same thing over Washington, D.C., perhaps over Lafayette Park. So it does appear that the people who were at the controls were skilled pilots, and if they were the terrorists, they were obviously highly trained.
Well, it's also possible that they hijacked the airplane before it took off. I'm just, again, a wild guess, so that they were actually in the cockpit at the takeoff. And if you know that the one down in the Caribbean that crashed, the hijacker was in the right seat while the captain was in the left seat. It's possible, if he thinks they're just going to hijack the airplane, you'll do whatever they say. And if he says, I'm going to sit in this right seat, you take off, that's what you do, because you assume he's just going to go somewhere and land and refuel and that type of thing.
How difficult has this day been for you watching these planes being flown in the buildings and the Pentagon?
It was difficult at first, especially when I found out there were crews involved, and when I found it was United, it was even more so. But the whole thing has been very difficult. I have been busy most of the day and haven't seen an awful lot of it, but what I have seen is just, as the word everybody uses, horrific, and it's a very emotional thing for anyone.
Al Haynes, thank you very much for being with us. It still was a marvel of piloting that you did when you landed that plane in Sioux City, Iowa. That was a United Airlines plane that had lost most of its controls, and he was able to bring it in a controlled crash landing. They did lose some of the passengers, obviously, but any number of them were saved as a result of his great skills in the cockpit. We want to show you some remarkable scenes now from inside Air Force One. This is the fighter jet escort that Air Force One had as it flew back to Washington today from the Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base. That may become a routine procedure for the president as he flies domestically in this country as well as internationally. It's not always a conspicuous presence. You generally have planes when you're flying with the president over disputed areas that are in the vicinity, but you don't see him flying that closely off the wing of Air Force One. They're on their approach now to Andrews Air Force Base. That's an F-16. I think I can only see one tail sticking up, so I think it's an F-16 that helped escort them back to Andrews Air Force Base. Let's go to Dateline's Keith Morrison, as he has been taking the pulse of this country. America, in all of its complexity and all of its parts, becomes a family on a day like today. Here's Dateline's Keith Morrison.
In a moment, everyone knew things can't be the same anymore. And all across the country, as shock gave way to fear or anger or some other emotion, officials in charge of places and events shut them down. Suddenly, this is a country in which security means everything. Airports almost everywhere closed.
No airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States until the ground stop is lifted.
Hundreds of people at airports all around the country crowded around TV sets, stunned.
It's unbelievable to me that people can crash planes in the World Trade Center and collapse on thousands of people. All the rescue workers outside there. It's absolutely devastating.
I don't think anybody in this nation is going to be able to sit down at dinner this evening or any evening from now on and consider ourselves to be completely safe. This is crazy.
The order to close for the first time, the entire national air traffic system came early from the Federal Aviation Administration. Many of those airports were evacuated. For how long? Who knows? At least until tomorrow afternoon, perhaps longer. No one's ever done such a thing before, ever.
I think our security is going to be so tight tomorrow that you're not going to believe it. It's going to take a long time to get everybody cleared. I mean, they're going to be doing hand searches. They're going to be doing all kinds of stuff. It's going to be the top level of security that we have tomorrow.
Markets, of course, just stopped. How could they operate here? Already, the financial loss has been in the billions. And, said UCLA finance professor Bradford Cornell, it will hurt for some time.
Investors are likely to get frightened. That will lead to a dramatic drop in stock prices.
And now, says Cornell, now that many institutions and companies will try to be more careful about security, we'll keep paying.
That throws sand into the gears on which our economy runs. And it's going to make the cost of doing business greater, corporate profits lower, and that will depress stock prices and economic activity, even in the long run.
But that's for some other day. Today, nationwide, flags were lowered to half-staff. Many states closed their public buildings. Courthouses shuttered. Trials postponed. Popular landmarks locked up. Seattle's Space Needle. The Disney parks on both coasts. Even the U.S. Mint shut down. The national pastime went the way of the national mood. Baseball commissioners announced that the schedule is off indefinitely. And for the Emmys, postponed indefinitely. Who felt like celebrating?
This weekend is not the weekend to put on this telecast.
In Texas, thousands of people flocked to a prayer vigil at Southern Methodist University.
Help us to make sense of senseless acts.
Psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Kingsbury said he expects a lot of people will want to be overcautious for a while.
Our sense that we live in a safe society where we have good protections against external threats has been taken from us.
And a terrorism expert, Peter Chalk, who spoke to us over the phone because security kept him out of downtown Washington, told us overreacting towards safety might be a good idea for a while.
That symbolic message that's been transmitted across the world will have profoundly affected the image of the United States abroad, of invulnerability, and that the U.S. can be brought in to the very front line of this sort of attack.
And what wasn't shut down today, we are much more careful about guarding. The border with Mexico and with Canada closed for a while. Security around military installations like this one is at extraordinary levels, of course, also at atomic plants and the other sensitive places in the American infrastructure, which in the past had seemed impervious. No longer. The terrorism expert worries that in their fear and anger, Americans may decide it's time to end this country's famous openness. That would be a mistake, he says.
Without a doubt, I mean, one of the prices you pay for being in a democratic society is that you have to live with a certain risk threshold. The only way you could realistically counter a lot of these dangers is to have a closed society, but that's not what we're about.
America may be a little different after today, a little more conscious of external threat. As the psychiatrist said, we may have some new routines now.
Does that mean that there'll never be another hijacking or terrorist attack? Probably not. Does it mean the vast majority of us will feel safer? Definitely, eventually.
But not today. Today we interviewed the doctor in a park because security at his university office kept our cameras outside.
That's Dateline's Keith Morrison on the mood of this country on this stunning day that so brought together America in grief and shock, frustration and anger and determination to go forward as well. We do have some additional information for you. A top New York City police official said at the end of the news conference by Mayor Giuliani that, in fact, there are people still alive trapped in the rubble of the World Trade Center. He wouldn't say how many, but they're bringing in heavy construction equipment to move a lot of the big blocks of concrete that have come down and the steel beams as well. And he says that they have recovered some victims who were still alive when they found them this evening. So that's the most heartening news that we've had from the site of this carnage in lower Manhattan so far tonight. The work will go on through the night and for several more days. John Hanson, the assistant fire chief in Oklahoma City, reminded us earlier that in Oklahoma City the rescue efforts were going on for 7 days before they were called to a halt, and they had a full accounting of all the people who were missing. And as horrendous as Oklahoma City was, it will pale in comparison probably in terms of the number of people who were in the World Trade Center when those two buildings came down, say nothing of that 40-story building that came down later, although that area had been evacuated by that time. NBC's Maria Shriver is in our Burbank Bureau tonight, and she has been looking at the people who were on those flights that were destined, most of them for Los Angeles, although one flight was headed for San Francisco. Maria, what can you tell us?
Well, Tom, as you have been reporting, as you just mentioned, all 4 of the hijacked planes were headed here to California, 1 to San Francisco, 3 here to Los Angeles. And the news that came here to California when people heard that those flights were coming here brought this city almost 3,000 miles away from the New York World Trade Center to almost a complete standstill. Los Angeles was one of the first airports in the country to get the early morning call to close down.
Los Angeles International is one of the airports that we've asked to be evacuated early on.
That unprecedented move spread fear throughout the city that terrorism might be heading west. The city went into high alert. Federal buildings, City Hall, and the courts were all evacuated, and that was just the beginning. The chief of police attended an emergency council meeting and went on television to try and calm people's fears.
We certainly want to, again, reassure the public that all is safe in the city of L.A. We certainly have no guarantees, but we're certainly looking at all of the precautionary measures to ensure that the community is as safe as possible.
And while there were no terrorist incidents, nonetheless, businesses came to a standstill. Disneyland closed its doors not just in California, but throughout the world. Virtually all studios closed down, including Jay Leno, who suspended production for the rest of the week. Tonight's Latin Grammys were also canceled, so was Madonna's concert and sporting events for the near future. Even the Emmys canceled Sunday's awards ceremony.
A celebration and a comedy show would just not be something that would be appropriate for this country this weekend.
By mid-afternoon, the state's governor felt it necessary to go on television and reassure all Californians that their state was indeed secure.
First of all
All emergency services operations are up and running throughout California. Secondly, all law enforcement and firefighting personnel at the state level are fully deployed.
But despite the pronouncements from elected officials, this was a state in fear and shock.
It's like a movie. I can't believe that it could happen in this country.
And while thousands of Los Angelinos were stranded and frightened, the real concern here was for New Yorkers and for the families here in Los Angeles who had loved ones on those planes. American and United Airlines asked the Salvation Army and the Red Cross to be available today to offer pastoral and ministerial services to the families of victims.
It's just to be there and to say to them, we are here and we'll do whatever we can do to help you through this trauma and this pain.
Tom, it's important to note that neither American Airlines or United Airlines have officially released the names of the passengers on those 4 flights. But however, some family members have released some names, most notably David Angel and his wife Lynn were on the flight from Boston here to Los Angeles. Angel is well known as the producer, one of the producers of the hit television show Frasier. His colleagues released a statement this afternoon calling him an incredibly talented, kind, and gentle man, a man of incredible personal faith as well. He perished on that flight. Also, as we've been reporting, I know you have also Barbara Olson. She was the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson. She was on the flight from Washington to Los Angeles. She was one of the few passengers on several of these flights who managed to make a cell phone call to her husband where she told him that they were being hijacked. Moments later, her plane crashed into the Pentagon. Several other names have trickled out, but we don't know whether their kin have been notified, so we don't want to go out and actually tell you who they are. American Airlines and United have both asked us to publicize 800 numbers that they have put together. This is for family and friends who have questions, who want information about whether loved ones actually did get on those flights. The United hotline is 1-800-932-6555, and the American Airlines hotline is 1-800-245-0999. And they're quick to point out that people who are just who have no real personal connection should not tie up these lines. These are phone numbers for families, for concerned members of families who might have loved ones on those flights. But people here, if you flew over this city today, you wouldn't even recognize it because these normally clogged freeways were virtually empty. Many people kept their children at home from school, although the school system did go on as usual, and people have been asking the city to return to normal. But very much, this was a city very much in shock this morning. Throughout the day, people thought this terrorism might be headed this way. So we'll continue to keep you up to date on the California situation. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Maria Shriver. I suspect that was the case across the country as well, even for cities and small towns that were not the destination of these airplanes, that things did come to a stop today because it was one of those events in which America coalesces around its sense of national identity and shares the television set as well, trying to keep abreast of what has been going on. We're joined now by New York Governor Pataki, who has been down at the scene of this carnage all day long. Governor, tonight we heard a top New York City police official say that there are still people alive, that they do expect to recover some people from that wreckage throughout the night tonight. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, we certainly hope so. The rescue efforts are ongoing, and they have the highest priority. We have the city of New York has the finest police and fire rescue teams in the world. They've been augmented by our state, National Guard, and federal help, and everything that can be done is being done, and we're just praying that we can recover some people who might be in the rubble right now.
The New York City Firemen's Union reported earlier that it had lost 200 of its members when the buildings came down. Is there any confirmation of that you have independently?
We don't have any confirmation of particular numbers, but we know this is one of the darkest days in American history, and our prayers are with those who have lost their lives, with the brave families of the firefighters and the police who risked their lives to save others and were victimized by this terrorist attack. And our prayers are with those who are afraid their parents might not come home tonight. But we're going to continue to have hope. We're going to continue to work to get through this and to make sure that everything is done to try to recover anyone who might still be alive downtown.
That is the highest priority, obviously, and to treat those who have been injured and to recover those who have been killed. You have any sense at all as to when that financial district can return to some semblance of normality?
Tom, as you know, we've closed New York City south of 14th Street for tomorrow. The point right now is to make sure the entire focus is on the rescue and the search efforts, and that the emergency crews can get in and out as easily and as readily as possible. And we'll make a determination tomorrow, probably at the end of the day, what additional parts of the city may be open tomorrow afternoon. But right now, the entire focus has to be on the rescue and search efforts.
You used to have an office in the World Trade Center, didn't you?
I had my office in the World Trade Center, and the state today has had many, many offices and many employees in the World Trade Center, and I had friends there this morning.
And do you know what happened?
We don't know. We don't know. We're praying, and we're doing everything we can to try to rescue them.
Is there anything that the citizens of New York or surrounding areas should know in terms of what this city or what this state needs that they can do?
Tom, the citizens have been great. I was down at Cabrini Hospital a couple of hours ago, and we had lines around the blocks of people in line to donate blood. They're not letting terrorists drive them from the streets, and in fact, they're coming together. We are going to, as this process moves forward, need EMTs, nurses, additional support as the frontline forces downtown now go through this and need relief. And we set up state hotlines for nurses, doctors, EMTs, and others. And we're also organizing additional fire and police support so that we can rotate services in and out. But the spirit has been enormous. This is a very dark day, but out of this death and destruction, you can see hope. And we're not going to let these terrorist barbarians take away our freedom and take away our hope.
Finally, tough question, Governor Pataki, but what are your officials telling you about the population in those buildings when they came down?
We just don't know. We know that a number of people did get out and were evacuated before the buildings came down. At this point, we just don't know how many were not able to get out.
There's an unconfirmed report tonight from a New York radio station, Governor, that 2 men with a truckload of explosives were arrested at or near the George Washington Bridge. Do you know anything about that?
We've had all sorts of reports and rumors, and we've been in constant touch with federal officials, with the FBI and the national security officials, and we have no confirmed report of any such activity at this point. I also spoke with the President and the Vice President earlier today, and they have no information that additional terrorist threats have been targeted at New York or anywhere else at this point. Obviously, no one knew or anticipated the attacks this morning, so we can never be 100% sure. But at this point, I'm unaware of any direct security threats that the federal government is aware of.
Governor George Pataki, the governor of the state of New York, it's been a long and difficult day for you. It will not end at midnight tonight, obviously. We wish you the very best.
Thank you very much, Tom.
All right, Governor Pataki of New York. Barbara Olson, we have a picture of her, I think. She is the well-known CNN conservative commentator. Her husband is Theodore Olson, who is the Solicitor General of the United States, successfully argued on behalf of President George W. Bush before the U.S. Supreme Court in that contested presidential election growing out of Florida. This is a personal loss for the administration as well, because Barbara and Ted Olson were 2 of the most popular figures, especially in Republican social circles in Washington. They loved to entertain. They loved the opera. They were 2 people who were well known for their keen wit and their very keen intelligence. And she did get off a phone call to her husband on the cell phone before her plane crashed into the Pentagon today. So there is a personal loss at the White House tonight as well with the death of Barbara Olson. We're going to go now to Ashley Banfield, who is in downtown New York, not too far from the World Trade Center, where she has been throughout the day and had a very perilous experience herself. At one point, Ashley had to break some windows to get in the building to get away from the dust and smoke cloud.
Tom, when the second tower came down, unfortunately, my producer and I found ourselves in a far too close a situation, and we were finding ourselves running from the cloud that consumed us, and we had to break into a nearby building just to breathe, and we were followed by a New York police officer and also a security guard from the World Trade Center. We couldn't recognize either of them because we were all covered in so much white dust at the time. It was barely recognizable except for his badge. I just want to get you up to speed on what's happening now. We've been watching a number of different emergency vehicles filing into this area, but we're also watching as a number of semi-trucks roll in as well. We've been told that about 24 semi-trucks as well as 60 different dump trucks have been lined up and ready to go in to move away some of the large debris. As you're about to hear in a moment, there's a reason why they're having to remove that large debris before they can actually continue this search, because most of the searching on the surface of these two stumps of what were the World Trade Center towers didn't really provide much to anybody. There wasn't much to be found at all, certainly no one alive. And what's strange is very few cadavers as well. I'm joined by one of the firefighters who was one of the first on the scene. Lieutenant Pat Clancy has just come out from 12 hours in sort of the ground zero area, and I just want you to describe for me what happened when you first arrived, Pat, on the scene and you ended up going up onto the rubble heaps.
Myself and the firefighters from my company were ordered to go to, we were at a command post, we were ordered to go to where one of the towers was, tower, I believe it was the Tower 1. There was nothing really there but 10, maybe 5 or 6 stories of debris, and we slowly climbed as much as we could and started searching for people that might have been on surface, and trying to crawl into some of the crevices and crawling out, hitting tools, looking for possible firefighters or civilians.
You knew at the time there would be firefighter casualties. Did you have any idea that the number as it stands is about 200 of your colleagues?
We were assuming it would be a large amount, but firefighters, civilians, police officers, emergency workers, they're even a block away. There are fire trucks and police cruisers that are ambulances that are flipped over, burned out a block away.
Just quickly, you were able to call your wife via our cell phones when you got out of your 12-hour shift. She had no idea you were alive. What was her response to you?
She was hysterical, but I would imagine hundreds of firefighters are the same way, their wives.
Lieutenant Pat Clancy, thank you for talking to us, and good luck. Stay safe. I know you're going back in tomorrow, so be careful. Thank you. Tom, that's been the story from a number of the firefighters and emergency workers who've emerged from this, many of them covered in the white dust that you've seen probably throughout all of the pictures today. It's been just a tragic story all around, many of them knowing full well that they've lost a lot of friends, colleagues, and loved ones in that rubble as well.
Actually, because you have been isolated down there in a way you may not have heard, a top New York City official is now saying tonight that, in fact, there are some people who are alive in the rubble, and they do hope to get them out before the end of the night. He also said that they had recovered some people who were still alive when they got them out of the rubble, so there is some faint hope, at least, for people who have been trapped in there. We don't know the number by any means or how severely they are trapped at this time, but thank you very much. It's been a long and difficult and dangerous day for you, and we do appreciate the reporting. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who has some additional information for us on that United Airlines flight that left Newark bound for San Francisco and then was headed back toward the East Coast when it went down outside of Pittsburgh. Robert?
A couple of pieces of key information. It comes from a briefing that Attorney General John Ashcroft has just completed for members of Congress at the Capitol Police Headquarters down near the Capitol. First, before that Pennsylvania plane, he did tell the members of Congress that knives were the weapons used in these attacks. We had some inklings of that before from cell phone calls made from the planes, but as far as federal authorities know, knives were the weapons used. There are no reports yet of guns having been used in any of these 4 planes that were hijacked. Now, the point about that the 4th of the crashes, it was a United airliner that had taken off from Newark, and on the etching you can see it got out near Cleveland, and suddenly it diverts back east. There had been some speculation that it might have been headed for Camp David, but Attorney General Ashcroft in his briefing for members of Congress said it was turning back for Washington, D.C. He did not say any particular target. In fact, I guess there'd be no way for him to know what target they had in mind, but he did believe that they had Washington in mind as a destination, and there's some indication they might have actually filed some kind of flight plan from the air saying that. He also said one other thing, that plane was not shot down. Now, there'd been no evidence that it was, but there were rumors around earlier in the day. Many people wondered, gee, could they have heard that it was going for the White House or something? Could anyone have actually dared to have ordered it to be shot down, even with all those people on it? because of national security, but Attorney General Ashcroft put an end to that. He said the plane was not shot down from the air, not shot down by any missile. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. Any additional word, by the way, Bob, on when flights may be resumed?
No, they're still saying noon tomorrow Eastern time is when they're going to consider it, but it's not certain that that's when it will come. At any rate, it's clear that there'll be a lot more security checks. That there's going to be, for openers, no more curbside baggage, and there are going to be scattered checks for identification and personal checks of handbags, that kind of thing. It's going to be time-consuming.
All right, thank you very much. We've just heard a stunning number from the Pentagon. We've been trying all night long to get some fix on the number of casualties there. NBC Jim Miklashevsky stands by now. Jim?
Tom, the latest figures from Arlington firefighters, who are really in charge of the firefighting and rescue efforts here, an estimated 800 killed inside the Pentagon, many of them still buried in the rubble that you see behind us. They brought in heavy earth movers, cadaver dogs, in an effort to find those who are still buried in the rubble. Very little hope, really, of finding anyone still alive, given the intensity of the fire inside and the severity of the damage to the building, the total collapse of all 5 floors down onto the ground floor. So, again, the latest estimate, 800 dead in the Pentagon. Tom?
We should assume that the majority of those are military personnel, or would it be a mix as well of civilian employees and military personnel?
Given the portion of the building, Tom, it's probably primarily military, Navy, Marines, some Army, and of course some civilians mixed in.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Jim Miklashevsky. The very disquieting news that at least 800 people were killed at the Pentagon, more than 266 were killed on those airplanes, an untold number still unaccounted for in lower Manhattan. This has been, as we have been saying all day long, a day quite unlike any other in American history. There's never been an attack of this severity or this magnitude within the continental United States. People are comparing it to Pearl Harbor, but at that time we did know who the enemy was. It did get the United States involved in World War II. This, of course, a shadowy terrorist attack using civilians against civilians, hijacked airliners as guided missiles. We want to share with you now just some of the first-person accounts of the people who have gone through this long, unending, and difficult day.
On any given day, New York is a city with its own sounds, with its own rhythm. Today, you could feel a collective shudder as it all came crashing down, and the voices of those at ground zero are still shaking. Fathers.
All of a sudden, we felt the second one go.
Mothers.
We all heard this just really loud explosion.
Daughters.
A huge explosion and a shudder.
And our own colleagues at NBC.
I never thought that it would happen here.
Tom Lochtefeld, at work at a trading firm on the 80th floor of World Trade Tower 2 when the first plane hit.
All you could see were papers and smoke just flying through and around the plaza. And we looked up about maybe 10 or 15 floors up, and the whole wall was blown out, and it was filled with flames. And everybody was just like in awe. We had no idea what it could be. And suddenly our 2 managers in the office, they came screaming in with an urgency that I've never, ever heard before in anybody's voice, saying, "Get out, get out, get out, get out." We had gotten down to about the 50th floor from the 80th floor, and there was a PA announcement, and they kept saying, there's a fire in World Trade number 1. The firemen are attending to it. World Trade Center is secure. You may return to your offices. Repeatedly, repeatedly. And everybody just stood in sort of disbelief.
Tom didn't go back. It was far from secure. Just minutes later, the second crash right into his office.
If I went back up, I would have been dead. And if I didn't leave the minute that I left, I would be dead. And God bless the people who were on the 110th floor, because if I was down at the 50th, they were down at the 80th.
It took 15 minutes to get out, but once there...
People had left their shoes to get away. I mean, there were piles of blood in the street of people who had gotten hit by shrapnel from the buildings.
Your wife, you know, she said to me that she thought she was a widow.
Kim White was stuck on the 74th floor of Tower 1.
The doors were locked.
Why?
I have no clue. We sat around for about 5, almost 10 minutes trying to find a door or get somebody with a key to come open the doors so we can get downstairs. If we had those precious 5 to 10 minutes, would have made that much of a difference.
A difference because she barely managed to escape as the building was collapsing.
Glass just flying all over the place, and we're not knowing which way to go because we didn't know which way the building fell. Once it hit ground, all you saw was blackness. I'm sitting here saying to myself, breathe.